Hello and welcome back to this damn food idealistic crusade. I am the motion picture analyst, and this will be the next in my series of commentaries devoted to the official Eon James Bond films. This is, of course, dealing with the first of the Pierce Brosnan era, 1995's Goldeneye, directed by Martin Campbell, and the 17th film in the official series, and the first after the 6-year gap between License to Kill and Goldeneye that kept us from getting a third Timothy Dalton film and really signaled a sea change in the Bond franchise because, of course, by the time of GoldenEye's preparation and then eventual release, the entire geopolitical status of the world had changed in the post-Cold War era. So, of course, there was much talk of Bond being outdated, and especially with License to Kill not being very successful at the box office and being seen in most quarters as a financial failure, there was a great pressure on the entire Eon production team to make GoldenEye successful because, of course, essentially the entire franchise rode on the success of this one film, and had it not been a box office hit, there was it would really be an uphill battle from there to continue the Bond series. Of course, the major shift also occurred outside of the lead actor, in that this was the first film to not be completely produced by Cubby Broccoli, who stepped down and essentially turned the franchise over to Barbara Broccoli, his daughter, and his stepson, Michael G. Wilson, who had been a longtime producer and co-screenwriter throughout the 1980s, and really had been involved with the films going all the way back to Goldfinger, when he wound up substituting in for certain location shots, portraying Oddjob for Harold Sakata. So, of course, Cubby Broccoli was still around to be in sort of an advisory position, but his role was greatly diminished in terms of the day-to-day producing. So this is the point at which it became Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson in charge of the series. And you can see throughout the Brosnan era, the 4 films, starting with Goldeneye, a real desire to keep the core essence of the Bond formula intact, but also figure out a way to reinvent the series and reintroduce Bond to audiences and to make Bond a viable character. And so each film sort of takes its own different pathway of doing this. Some more successful than others, depending on who you talk to. Their reception has always been very varied between Bond fans, and over the years, you can really start to analyze them more and more, and get past the initial wow factor of seeing them theatrically. But of course, the wow factor with Goldeneye is that it was the first film in 6 years, and really did have a great hype built into it, especially after the announcement of hiring Pierce Brosnan, who of course was originally hired to do The Living Daylights in 1996, but due to NBC and Remington Steele, essentially lost the job. And we also had the fantastic teaser trailer. The folks at MGM and, of course, Eon really put together a really great marketing campaign with, again, just a teaser trailer that brought houses down. And it's still amazing to this day. Really great taglines, great poster imagery. So there was an audience there. And everyone was getting primed for the eventual, Christmas '95 release. And of course, Goldeneye became a box office hit and proved that Bond still had staying power. But the real trick of the story is that it has to make Bond a living, breathing character in the post-Cold War landscape. And how to do that and still have traditional Bond elements, but also make it modernized for the 1990s was a real challenge. And of course, the film eventually had 4 screenwriters. And I do think when you really get into deep analysis, you can sort of feel these different voices in terms of the storytelling and the narrative going on, and sort of things going back and forth, being pushed and pulled in different ways. And while I do think overall it's still a great story, I do feel you can sort of get the sense of there being some different voices in the writing. This started with Michael France's original draft, who basically came up with the general thrust of the story, but of course there are a lot of different elements, and this was just after he had come off of Cliffhanger, and I think he really injected a modern, dark tonality to the film that stayed and is still the essence of Goldeneye, really. Then next they brought on Jeffrey Kane, who I think really gave a greater essence of the feeling of spycraft and the sort of geopolitical state of the world, and that's why you get so much of Goldeneye feeling very grounded in sort of espionage, and Bond as a real intelligence man and having that weighty experience, I think there's an added sort of tinge to some of the dialogue that hints at this as well. And of course, he later went on to do the adaptation for the great film version of Le Carré's novel, The Constant Gardener. And then after this, they brought in the writer Kevin Wade, who, of course, his name was appropriated for the character of Jack Wade. And, of course, he sort of polished and built upon the two previous writers' work. And then he eventually was replaced or had to leave. And so Bruce Bierstein was the final writer who came on, and he sort of became the de facto writer of the Brosnan era because, of course, he would go on to write Tomorrow Never Dies and do the final drafting work on The World Is Not Enough. So Fierstein, or Feierstein, I'm never sure how to pronounce it, he was the one to really do the final sort of polish, and I think come up with a lot of the Bondisms that came to define the Brosnan era. And of course, this was all built upon on the stage, and particularly by Martin Campbell, the driving force of the film as the director. But I think it's important to note that there was a sort of journey and a sort of cobbling together of different writers' work, and Kevin Wade isn't even credited, and it's very difficult to know who did what exactly. The Michael France draft is floating around online, so that is you can read that, but it is very different in a lot of ways. But you sort of have to just pore over the materials we have and listen to the commentary and sort of piece it together. But there are 4 different writers this time around, and I think you can hear some of their different voices throughout when you really want to analyze it. Another key factor is, of course, Martin Campbell coming on as director, who really does have an energy to drive the film, which is really essential for any Bond film. And I think he had the right idea to get the classic Bond-isms in there, but also make sure the narrative had a good pace to it, and we kept things moving, but also to get some nice grit and some reality into the storytelling. And he was pretty much tapped, I'm very sure, for his work on the great BBC spy miniseries Edge of Darkness, which, of course, featured Joe Don Baker very prominently, so I'm sure that's why he was tapped to play Jack Wade. And, of course, no actor does a second role in a Bond film, but completely different because, of course, he had played Whitaker in The Living Daylights in 1987. So I think Campbell's energy as a director really does infuse itself into the film and really heighten a lot of the lead performances. And, of course, most especially in Pierce Brosnan's performance, who really does a fantastic job in this new rendering of Bond. And I always like an actor's first go at the role because there is a sort of nervous energy there that I think enhances the performance. I think Brosnan definitely has that. But there's also, he conveys a great sense of Bond's past, and there's this weightiness, and especially in key moments. But also his Bond is one of analysis. And what Goldeneye is a film where James Bond has not changed, but the rest of the world has. So that was the sort of aim and goal of the film and Eon at the time. And that was their take on how to modernize Bond. Just modernize the world, keep Bond the same. And that's sort of the inverse of what they did in the next sort of generation. But the sort of how to make Bond viable in a post-Cold War landscape. So you see the film continually, poking at Bond, poking at the mythos, poking at his character, most obviously by making M female, and we get the now iconic sexist, misogynist dinosaur line, which of course is, very much on the nose, as is the Michael France line that Trevelyan has, the other probably most quotable line, the "Might as well ask you if all the vodka martinis ever silence all the screams of all the men you've killed," which that brilliant line, but it is very on the nose. But you look at how Bond takes it in the film, and it is very much not quite a deconstruction of Bond's character, but it's getting you inside his psyche. And this is something I think Brosnan carries on throughout his tenure, and really wanted to focus more on character and really get some dramatic meat to sink his teeth into. I think that the screenwriters here and after this, did try to sort of comply with that. So did the producers. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it's very promising. Sometimes it didn't necessarily work as well. But that's sort of what the Brosnan era is going for, and it's what I think he was always after in his take on the character, which again was something we hadn't quite seen before, and really helps sell this idea we get in Goldeneye of Bond is still the same character, still the same man, still has the same foibles, the same tastes, everything we love him for, but the joy is then seeing the old dog be able to play in the modern world and excel because, of course, of his experience and his personality. And it's very subdued, this quality I'm talking about, but I do think you can really pick up on it. The film is actually quite subtle in a lot of places. It's very trusting of its audience and not, spoon-feeding too much plot exposition, but also sometimes I think it goes a bit too far into sort of trying to maintain the vibe of a Euro thriller and being very not quite like an art film, but it's got a sort of labyrinth feel. So it does have a tinge of the feeling of reading a great spy novel, but also it's sort of, in a lot of ways, it is one of the most art film-like of a James Bond film, and a lot of that, I think, really comes down to the editing of the film. Of course, the editor was Terry Rawlings, the great editor who, of course, also most famously edited Blade Runner. And he doesn't go for the traditional Peter Hunt fast-cutting style that established the series. He has his own particular rhythms, and I think he picks up on what Brosnan is doing and what the energy Campbell put into the film and the more, grounded orientation of the story and this whole Euro thriller vibe. And so Goldeneye has a particular pace to it. It picks up in the requisite action sequences, but it also knows when to slow down and sort of coil itself like a snake almost. And it's very strange to describe when you really look at it, but it has this particular rhythm that no other Bond film really has. And of course, it was the last Bond film to date that was, shot on film and also cut on film, because of course, on Tomorrow Never Dies, that was the first film edited digitally on the Avid system. So that's also another key difference. Goldeneye was the first James Bond film to really utilize digital effects. License to Kill predated the whole CGI explosion in the 1990s. It was also the first film in the series to get a release in the digital sound era. So this is a full-on 5.1 90s balls-to-the-wall mix in terms of really trying to use all the discrete surround capabilities of the modern multiplex at the time. So there are some technological improvements, but of course it also has a firm grounding in practical effects work, and it signaled the return of the incredible legend Derek Meddings, who unfortunately this would prove to be his final film because he died of cancer shortly thereafter the film was finished. But this film is chock full of some of the most amazing model work you'll ever see, and of course, as with practically all of Derek Meddings' work, it is invisible unless you're really looking for it or it's there. So there is incredible practical effects use in the entirety of the film, and of course intermixed in with CGI usage to sort of fill out the gaps that they couldn't do practically. So it's a perfect melding of practical effects and the CG realm, and of course, since it is very much mostly practical effects, the effects have stood the test of time very well. And of course, lastly, I should also mention that, of course, they wound up having to construct their own studio at the old Rolls-Royce plant. So Leavesden Studios was essentially created for Goldeneye, and then Peter Lamont took it over to pretty much, do the entire set design and everything there, which eventually included recreating the entirety of St. Petersburg for the tank chase. So this is where Leavesden came from and became really the second time that the Bond team wound up having to construct their own studio spaces, because of course they had to do something similar, not to the same extent of literally building a whole studio, but sort of a dry run when they wound up having to construct studio space in Mexico City during License to Kill's production. So, of course, Goldeneye had quite a lot riding on it, and it became the new introduction to James Bond for an entire generation of new fans on its release in 1995. Really captured the youth audience who really didn't have any knowledge of Bond at that time. And it really brought Bond back to the forefront of pop culture, which is really what it needed to do more than anything. And of course, now that the film series was, still firmly tied to MGM, there were new personnel in charge at MGM, and they had to work with Eon and also have their own input, since they owned 50% of the film series, dating back to when Harry Saltzman sold his shares to United Artists in 1975. So there were, of course, again, as I said, new blood at MGM, and there was a desire overall to really push Bond firmly into the modern world of the mid-1990s and to reference perhaps the elements that were considered maybe outdated by that time period, but to not mess with them, because that's of course what makes Bond Bond. And I think the genius masterstroke of the film, it was in recognizing that and finding other ways to make the film modern and feel vibrant to a 1995 audience and to Bond fans as well. And Goldeneye remains the most successful film of the Brosnan era of the 4 films. I think that's a very easy statement to make. I think most people would agree with that. It still remains the most satisfying of the 4. I think it's the most polished overall. It's not perfect, mind you, but it's also not the reboot that a lot of people like to claim it now as being, as sort of a soft rebooting of the franchise, which is something that's much more commonplace now, with everybody and their brother having a franchise or wanting a franchise or reworking it or remaking stuff constantly. But back then, it was totally a matter of literally trying to jumpstart the dead engine that was the Bond series, which had been tied up in legal nightmares, causing the 6-year gap between License to Kill and Goldeneye. So Eon and the production team and MGM really did pull off what the entire industry thought was an impossible feat, and this really was also what MGM was banking its entire future on. If Goldeneye failed, that was pretty much the last straw for MGM in 1995 for their attempt at relaunching the studio as a viable production studio and a major studio. So there was an incredible amount riding on Goldeneye, and it still plays well today, but I do think it, like the other 3 films of the Brosnan era, you can really analyze it a lot more, because a lot of the issues are much more on the surface, and we have so much more in terms of production materials to dig into and more information about the writing. So you can sort of peer behind the corners, or peer behind the curtain a little bit more than what you can do on the older films, where there is less direct source information and, of course, much more distance of time. So that's it for my pre-ramble, as I like to call my track introductions. So we will do a rough sync, so go ahead and go to whichever version of the film you wish to view along with the commentary track, and go ahead and cue it to somewhere in the black area between the United Artists and MGM logos, just before the start of the gun barrel iris. That's usually the best place to try and sync, because of course different versions usually have different logos on the front. And since this is, as with my previous tracks, these are not professionally recorded. I'm just winging it into a microphone. Don't worry if you're not exactly on point. We should be, roughly in the same place. Since Goldeneye was released in the 5.1 digital sound era, thankfully it has never been remixed for the most part. It does have problematic video transfers, especially the Blu-ray, but the actual sound really hasn't changed. However, I would point out that if you do have the really amazing Laserdisc version or the first couple DVDs, the Dolby track on there is the theatrical Dolby Digital track, which has quite a bit of extra bass, especially in its LFE subwoofer channel. So I always like to jokingly refer to it as the club mix of Goldeneye, because it's very boomy. So if you've ever noticed that, and I really love the sound mix of this film, I really love the sound design. So I've studied it way too much. But if you've ever noticed that, that's why. That's something seemingly Dolby did a lot in the mid-1990s during the sort of digital sound wars with DTS. A lot of films with Dolby tracks usually have a bit more bass to them, I guess, to maybe feel more impactful or something. Eventually that did get mixed out, so modern releases don't have that. But if you have the first 2 DVDs, or the special edition one with the cool menus, or the Laserdisc, that has what I like to call the club mix of the film. The DTS version on Laserdisc is I think the best sounding release. It doesn't have that extra bass boominess to it, but it's got even more clarity in the discrete channel usage and the sound effects, and of course due to the increased quality and the increased bitrate size. That is just a fantastic experience, and I think slightly better even than the Blu-ray lossless audio, which itself is very good. So again, this is a film that sounds good on every release, but there are those little minor quirks I like to point out, as I do with all these tracks when I'm talking about the audio side of things. And but at least it hasn't been remixed, and you can still enjoy its really excellent 5.1 sound mix that has a certain style to it, just like the film. So I think it very well matches what the film is trying to do. So with that out of the way, go to whichever copy of the film you wish, and we will do a rough sync count-in. All right, so go to your copy of the film, and again, try and cue it up in the black area before the gun barrel irises start to come in. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, press play now. So we're in the gun barrel with a really striking, of course, electronic version of the James Bond theme performed by Eric Serra. Of course, announcing the Serra score, which is often derided, but something I really think fits the film, and particularly in the opening pre-title sequence, really sets the mood and the ambiance. And of course, this is the now, I think, pretty iconic opening sequence of the film, set in 1986 as Bond and 006 Alec Trevelyan are sent in to destroy a Soviet chemical facility. And what this does, actually very ingeniously, I think, is give us a Cold War opening. So we see Bond in his natural element, and then, after this is over and we get the mini adventure, we are put right into 1995. So we see at the start of the film Bond at his peak, in his element, what people are going to be more used to. And of course, we get the jaw-dropper opening stunt of the, at the time, record-breaking bungee jump off the dam. And of course, completely done for real, and one of the great moments in the series that makes every member of the audience totally catch their breath. That just the sheer audacity of the stunt. And of course, this is, patterned after trying to match the iconic Union Jack parachute opening of The Spy Who Loved Me. And of course, I love the sound design where you get the wind picking up, everything else drops out, and then we hear the noise of the bungee cord. Then you see the stuntman have to get the prop out. Of course, it was incredibly difficult, and he gets it out right before he passes through behind the rock. And as you see, Pierce Brosnan's face is kept in shadow to sort of build the reveal, as we see with every new Bond. And due to the black combat fatigues, it is very reminiscent of Timothy Dalton's introduction in The Living Daylights. But again, with the color and the locale we're seeing, the how driven Bond looks, and the combat fatigues and the Cold War setting, this definitely it feels grounded in spycraft. And I don't know if the level of danger quite comes across in the film, how much of, in terms of the story, this is supposed to be a suicidal mission, like with a very high chance of failure, this infiltration mission into a secret underground Soviet chemical facility. But we get the film's first dash of humor, where Bond's introduction is literally handled upside down in the loo. I always love the way that Brosnan's feet slide out, and we get our first proper close-up with the nice sort of pounding bits of Serra's score. This is known as the Goldeneye Overture, but is perhaps the most iconic on the soundtrack release. And we see all these little bits of everyday life going on in this Russian facility. Really wonderful production design by Peter Lamont. I love how lived in this facility feels. And now we're in the storeroom, and we see all this stuff on the walls, and we see the Russian writing everywhere, and it's very worn out. And now we see the canteen, and everybody's sitting around, so it just definitely kind of looking on the miserable side. And then Bond turns a corner, and 006 is introduced out of the dark. Little tiny bit of maybe a jump scare a little bit, but of course his face is kept in shadow, and he speaks in Russian first. and then he comes into the light. There's a lot of wonderful little quirks and nods that once you've seen the film the first time and you know the villain reveal and you know that Alec becomes the villain and is Giannis, it's really rewarding when you see the film multiple times because there's so much more weight to their banter and Alec's for England James here. It really adds to it. And you can see these little quirks that are in Sean Bean's performance that show that Alec is definitely already maybe a little bit unhinged, particularly when he comes up and assassinates the poor scientist. He gets this really cold look on his face when he just blows the guy away. Of course, they would have to eliminate them, but it just seems rather cold-blooded how he just literally shoots him in the back. And of course, the banter between Bond and Alec set up the relationship between the two, and it never feels forced. But another key moment here when Bond recognizes that, as he says, too easy, something sets off his senses, his sixth sense of danger. And of course, at first you think Alec is simply, too gung ho, and that everything will turn out fine. Not only does this show that he's, a little less experienced, being, perhaps the second of the 00 men and not the senior man as Bond is, but also that, of course, once you've seen the film the first time, you know that this is obviously set up somehow and is how Alec is going to fake his death. We never find out the machinations, if he'd already worked this out with Oromov somehow, but he probably would have had to somehow due to Oromov supposedly shooting him in the head. Again, there's a great tone throughout this. We get Sarah's score coming through. We get more of the banter with the bits about last call in the pub and buy me a pint. But you see Bond's professionalism, the way he's focusing on the timers and he's setting everything up, but also the way he muses over everything. He's been through this scenario before. So he has the requisite swagger. How original. Once the explosion goes off and the sound drops out, we now know something has gone wrong. Now the banter has stopped. Bond realizes this. And, of course, is careful enough to slip through the chemical containers to where they can't get a clear shot at him because, of course, the flammability is so high that one wrong ricochet would torch the whole place. The staging of Oromov and his men and everything is really great when we get the reveal shot of Alec on his knees. Now we know Bond has a plan in place. He is conflicted. He is going to try and save Alec. But by switching the timer, he has his backup plan. And then another nice touch in the reaction shot when Brosnan goes back and we see Bond pick up the AK. And that moment here where you could see his grief for a moment. That's really great. And it shows that, he does definitely feel 006's death, but he doesn't have time to muse over it. He'll have the rest of the years after this point to do that. Now we get the fun bit with the squeaky wheel on the chemical tray, which is the nice bit of humor that helps to alleviate some of the tension, gives it that Bondian flair, Bond being creative. And of course now we have a little lift from the Wild Bunch with the guard who fires off too much, who then Oromov executes. It's wonderful what Gottfried John does with Oromov throughout the film. The sort of the way that he lets himself be amused by Bond, and now there's seemingly nowhere for Bond to go. You can't win. Bond, of course, always has that one extra bit of pizzazz that the villains can't yet put together with the requisite big escape from that scenario. Now we're on to the runway sequence where it culminates in the fantastic motorcycle dive after the plane. It must be said that even people in the production weren't too happy with Eric Serra's score, so there are moments throughout the film where it does feel sort of definitely dialed back in the mix. Like you can really feel it here. It does have a great presence, but it is definitely sort of dialed back, particularly in some of the action cues in terms of the levels underneath the sound effects. Of course, I've always loved how committed that Brosnan is in his run, during the James Bond run, is a very difficult thing for any actor to do and to really sell it. Now, the image that comes up here with the bike going after the plane is absolutely incredible, and of course is done completely for real. It took them several takes to do. I think this was like 7 or 8 takes to get this, and it's, again, just another breathtaking moment. Unfortunately, they had to resort to doing process footage and go on a stage to do Bond actually catching up to the plane. And, this is a point where it really does stretch the laws of physics, and it is very much unrealistic to have Bond physically in free fall catch up to a falling plane. Earlier drafts and other things staged it a bit differently, but that image of going off the bike, going off the cliff, and then getting to the plane is amazing. And then Brosnan's performance here and the intensity built in the editing of how close the plane dives, and then we eventually lose it. But then we get the slow track in under Brosnan's eyes that matches the first shot when he's cutting open the hatch, gives a nice intensity. And when the plane rises, we get the engine come into the surrounds. And another fun little bit, throughout the mix you hear some old British Sound Library effects. That plane sound is actually in License to Kill, goes all the way back to the 1980 Flash Gordon and before that. It's the nice little nod touch I like in the sound mix, that they built in some classic Sound Library effects. Now we go into the title sequence, the nice bullet swish in the soundtrack, with the really fantastic Tina Turner title song. It was actually written by Bono and The Edge. Still wonder why U2's never actually done a Bond theme, but this is as close as they've gotten. Wonderful titles, first time around for the now standard title artist of the series, Danny Kleinman, taking over from Maurice Binder, who unfortunately had passed away after License to Kill. And really, Kleinman finds his own way of doing what Binder did, but not making it obvious by following in his stead, but coming up with these incredible images that, don't just rely on CG tools, and always he finds these great ways of tying it into the story. So we have the traditional female figures in and out of silhouette, but I love the blending with the figures of communism. We have the statues, we have the hammer and sickle. We also have elements of Bond. We'll see the floating PPKs and all kinds of various things, and then even an actual literal Goldeneye. I think my favorite image in this title sequence, though, has to be the double-headed, double-faced girl figure here, meant to symbolize the two-faced figure of Hiatus. Of course, will be the main villain. So on one side she has the cigar, on the other side she has the pistol barrel come out and fire in front of Soviet flags. It's just an incredible image. Same thing here, very simple with the Walther PPKs that come up in the air, but of course have a dancing silhouetted girl in the bear coming out of the barrel. Again, in the cast and crew, you do see some returning figures, some interesting figures that are specific to GoldenEye. Terry Rawlings there, as I mentioned before. Phil Mayhew took over as cinematographer and really helps to give a true gloss, a high gloss to the visuals that really help sell the fantastic high living aspect of Bond that a lot of people complain wasn't quite there in the 1980s as much, and it is really nice to see that sort of high gloss come back. And I love the image of the girl with the hammer hitting the sickle, going into the Goldeneye, and then back into a literal gun barrel to come out onto a beautiful car-mounted shot, racing down the roads above Monte Carlo, and we see the return of the Goldfinger Aston Martin DB5. And of course, it doesn't need any explanation. Of course, I've always thought it was interesting that the license plate is very close to Goldfinger's, but of course it's BMT 2146A. Now, this scene with Caroline, the analyst from MI6 sent to evaluate Bond, is literally the film as the scene is the film in a microcosm. It reflects everything because the film is literally analyzing Bond. And we get this fun byplay that introduces us to Xenia with this incredibly shot chase, staged and directed by the legendary Remy Julian, who essentially here is sort of trying to one-up himself, because this whole chase is actually based on a chase in an earlier film that he did called The Marseille Contract, where you have Michael Caine and an Alfa Romeo versus a beautiful girl and a yellow Porsche, and they go down a similar road and have this back-and-forth byplay. But what I've always loved about it is the way that Brosnan as Bond enjoys the moment, the little laughs he has, the glances that Bond and Xenia have, and this no words are exchanged, but it sets up their character interplay and is straight out of Fleming, really. Bond is never more turned on than being passed by a pretty girl at speed. That's right out of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the way that he's introduced to Tracy for the first time. What I've really always loved about this sequence is the dynamics of the visuals, just the car mounts that they have for the cameras. And, a lot of people like to point out that sequence in the Marseille Contract. But again, with the advent of, over 20 years, they really are one-upping that. And again, it's very intrinsic to the scene going on, because it is Bond literally demonstrating his contentment, his content for being judged, and his reliance on his own instincts, and of course that plays out throughout this chase, because it's not something that's very easy to do, and shows Bond's driving skill, which is something I always really appreciate, because the genius of a Bond chase is not in the gadgetry, but showing Bond's skill as a driver. And this constant byplay back and forth. Now we get the sort of comedic payoff with the cycling team that all gets knocked over. Of course, Ladies First names the Eric Serra track that backs this, which is another one of those that a lot of people like to complain about as feeling too out of key and out of place, but I actually really like it. I do like the Serra score. I think it does fit tonally with everything going on, but again, you can tell in the mix they did dial it down. It is very low, in terms of the overall level. And of course, Bond, as always, has a backup plan for how to charm the positive evaluation out of Caroline, and also show the audience that Bond's ways are still set in stone, and even though this is 1995, you can still have the traditional sort of fun with a Bond film. But again, it has a self-awareness, not just in Bond, but the film itself has a self-awareness. And this is really, I think, the first time this had ever happened in the series. Now we come to this transitional scene, which is one of my favorite moments in the entire film, where it's very simple. Bond arrives at the casino. That's it. But we have the first appearance of Sarah's We Share the Same Passions theme. It's very... It shows Bond as the outsider, which he is. He is the ultimate outsider. He cannot get close to anyone. And while he can move through the world and observe everything, like now he sees Xenia's Ferrari with, of course, the incorrect French registration plates. He moves to the casino with perfect assurance. This is one of the great Bond entering casino moments, which we rarely get anymore these days. Again, we see the great high gloss in Phil Mayhew's cinematography, which is just all over this. And we get a wonderful classic back and forth with Bond and the sort of villainous character. But of course, at this point, we don't know Xenia is going to be the villainess of the film. It's potential that she could be the Bond girl or an ally of sorts. But again, the back and forth we had in the car chase earlier, now we have all these double entendres in the dialogue and the way that they are playing and the way that they're handling their cards, and you can see everyone around the table senses that there's something going on between the two. But it's really cool to see Bond sort of probing for information and trying to out-manipulate Xenia. It's also interesting to see Bond lose the first hand. But again, there's this sort of distance even here between Bond and everyone else. And again, I think that transitional scene of Bond arriving at the casino with the Sarah Q, it really sets up this Bond is an outsider in the modern world, and his experience gives him this weightiness that he carries with him always. And of course, this ultimately comes fully realized in the beach scene later in the film between Bond and Natalia. And of course, Bond's one-upmanship here by turning the tables is, right out of Fleming, but, very much inspired by the casino scene between Bond and Largo and Thunderball. And of course, Brosnan does it with perfect assurance, wordlessly. And I like that Xenia gets, literally upset, and first of several times in the film where she'll let out a curse of frustration of sorts. Now again, Bond probing for more information, and gives us the moment for Brosnan to do his first interpretation of the classic introduction. And of course, it's really cute when you listen to the soundtrack, the music drops out for the reading of James Bond, and then immediately comes back in. They wanted to just make sure there was nothing else on the soundtrack at that point. And something I've always thought was really cute. And it's right here. You literally hear it go out. And of course, Brosnan does a beautiful line reading. Of course, that has to be the most terrifying moment for any actor in the role. But I love the way that he does it simply. And then again, Bond is doing this probing for information with Xenia and doing the byplay back and forth with the double entendres and the one-liners and things. But all of it is very barbed. All of it has multiple meanings. And you can see an enjoyment going back and forth. But as soon as he brings up the registration plates, you can see Xenia sort of react against this. I mean, like, okay, now this guy's really after something. And then she uses the excuse to immediately get away with Admiral Farrell, who we're like, who the heck is this guy? But of course, he will very much play into the next sequence. So there's a little element of mystery. There's a little element for Bond and the audience to chew over and bring together. And of course, we've been introduced to this fascinating character in the form of Xenia Onatopp. Again, Goldeneye is still a point where we can get little transitional scenes like this, essentially what would be termed as, sort of local flavor or backdrop. So it's a little bit of transition there to see this sort of silent play going on in this amphitheater. And now Bond is going to observe Xenia and the Admiral getting onto the launch to the Manticore. But again, it's always great to see Bond actually doing spycraft and following his hunches because, of course, at this point he doesn't have a mission, but something has aroused his suspicions. And later on we find that, he has suspicions that she is, linked to the Yanis crime syndicate, and they're a group that MI6 has been interested in. So essentially while Bond finds himself in Monte Carlo, he's going to follow his own hunches, which is key to selling Bond at any time. Bond is his own man. He's an intelligence man. And if something happens right under his nose, he's going to follow up on it. I love this little moment here when Bond looks over and we see a glimpse of the Tiger helicopter, which, of course, we don't know what's going on at this point. But it sets up, its appearance later on. Now, the fun gag of the fax that comes out of the Alpine stereo, complete with photograph and voice recording by Moneypenny. So it's our first glimpse of Moneypenny, but we're not actually seeing her. But we get a little twinge of the classic banter, but it's, of course, one-sided. Bond doesn't get the chance to respond, which is really fun because all Bond can do is give that little knowing smile. And then in a really cute transitional edit, we go right from Moneypenny's one-liner to the very aggressive little scene with Xenia, which will be Admiral Farrell's exit from the world. And of course, the notion of the well, of course, Xenia was KGB trained in her backstory, but the notion of the Soviet agent who, kills her lovers literally with her thighs actually dates back to the Living Daylights. The scene in Q's lab where they're going through the roster and Q literally reads out, and there's an agent who literally does this. So I have to think that was maybe a holdover from that brief mention back in the Living Daylights. And of course, the film did have a PG-13 rating, so they did have to be very careful and cautious with the sex and violence aspects. But really, I think they found a great way to play that and not run afoul of any censors. There's another cute edit there where Xenia's obviously getting her jollies, and we immediately cut to the boat engine creating the wake in the water. So there's a lot of fun little edits. But again, there's this sort of feeling. You can feel it here when Bond just climbs onto the boat and literally strolls in. The camera moves very confidently and slowly. Again, we're getting another flash of the tiger. Bond sees the reflection behind him. Again, sort of a Goldfinger nod. And Bond taking the guy out with a bit of fun, and then the charm of wiping the sweat off his brow with the towel. Now, I've always wondered who is actually playing the Admiral here. I think it's supposed to be Trevelyan. It would either be Trevelyan or Orumov, but due to location, I think it's Trevelyan with just a fake beard on. Of course, at this point, we don't know who it is. We just know that, of course, the launch of the Tiger is being infiltrated. Again, we're sort of in the dark like Bond, so the audience is having to piece together the sort of mystery puzzle pieces, which again keeps us involved and keeps us in the same realm as Bond at any given time. You can hear the reverberations of the sort of marching music and the start of the reception coming through, which again is what sort of, I think, helps Bond link to where they're obviously going. The fun shot of Farrell's corpse there with the rictus grin of sorts. Again, I have to say that Brosnan's appearance as Bond in the film, it's a little rougher. His hairstyling is a little longer, and I really do like that. He has a sort of feel of, there's a little roughness. He's got a sort of independence asserting itself even in the wardrobe and the posturing. So I think that sort of follows what Timothy Dalton did a little bit, particularly in The Living Daylights and License to Kill. You know, that sort of the suit looks great, but it's a little different from standard tailing, and the hair is a little rougher and longer. So, of course, now we see that they're infiltrating and going to steal the Tiger helicopter. And this was actually a pretty difficult scene to shoot because, of course, they had to get all kinds of governmental permission, and the helicopter itself was an experimental prototype, and there was only one of them in the world, and it was ludicrously expensive. So even things that seem simple like this were actually extraordinarily complicated to shoot. And I like when Bond is occasionally sort of helpless. He's, he doesn't quite know the full extent of what's going on, but he has to charge in anyway, and is manhandled and held at gunpoint and has to he's forced to watch the Tiger get away. And I love the note that Sarah hits in the score when we go to the close-up of Bond. Get a nice little lingering bit of the Tiger going off, and then eventually everybody realizing, hey, it's not coming back. But then the note on the score, Bond looks defeated. And then we're immediately going to cut over to Severnaya. There's a nice little pause that allows us to transition out into a completely new location. And again, right here, you see the amazing work of Derek Mannings, because all of this is not real. All of this is model work. Every bit of Severnaya you see, everything with the dish. And, of course, they're having to actually blow real snow around. And I love the transition. We do an actual transition into the underground Severnaya station there. Now we're introduced to Natalia Semyonova and Boris Grishenko, our next two major characters. Natalia, of course, becomes the de facto Bond girl of the film, played by Isabella Scorupco, and she's very much written and designed in sort of the mold of the Stacey Sutton, or especially the Carmen Lovi, in terms of being a, for lack of a better term, a working girl in a particular field who gets caught up in events greater than what she's used to. But unlike from before, those previous characters, she is much more independent, much more capable, and isn't in over her head as much. And Scorupco does a really nice job. I love her performance. The problem is that Natalia does do stuff, but she doesn't have a whole lot of character development outside of, her character setup and initial appearance. And it actually wasn't until I read John Gardner's novelization of the film. This was did get a novelization by John Gardner. It was almost the end of his Bond tenure, but it's really well written, and it has a nice backstory for Natalia, some extra little bits of internal character monologue, and some extra little bits of spycraft, along with some ties to the Gardner Bond universe that really made me take a closer look at Natalia's character and look at more of the subtleties and things. So now I can't help but read that stuff into there, because that is ostensibly what the actress was playing off of, and the sort of backstory they built, but we just don't get any of that in the film. Now, when it comes to Alan Cumming as Boris, I adore every moment of Boris in the film. He is the comic relief, but he is, not just the annoying little worm, but particularly in this scene, the fun that they have with each other as Boris is literally hacking into the U.S. Department of Justice. But you read into this more, there's a darker edge, because, of course, if discovered, this would totally unmask Severnaya Station, which is a secret facility no one's supposed to know about. So Boris is really, he is the sort of rebel of the place with his, leather jacket and sort of rock star facade. But he's essentially doing this because he knows this is his last day here, because Oromov is about to come in and blow the place to hell, and he's apparently already constructed some sort of deal to be, Yanis's expert computer programmer. So he does this as sort of like the last ditch, haha, I have hacked U.S. Department of Justice, haha, now I am truly invincible. And yes, I quote Boris all the time. If I'm playing GoldenEye 64, which I still do frequently in the multiplayer, I'm always playing as Boris. One thing I've always wondered about, again, when you first see the film, you just think Boris kind of disappears, and when he appears later on, it's a nice little reveal. But you have to wonder, how does he get out of there here? The Tiger's only a 2-seater, and does he just get in the helicopter and scrunch down in the back at this point? Because we don't see what happens to him until he pops up later. Or does he, just have a car nearby, or another team of sled dogs? We don't really know. And, of course, as soon as we see Xenia in a military outfit, and now she's with Oromov, it's like, yeah, this can't possibly end well. a nice sort of setting the stage for what's going to come. Again, I really love Peter Lamont's design of the Severnaya Station. Again, feels very lived in, has all the accoutrements of feeling like what you would imagine a secret Russian computer facility underground in the middle of snow and ice would have to be like. And we get the wonderful business here with, as what Bond will point out later, the Russian access codes, the fail-safe system, and not just, setting up the extreme power of the GoldenEye device, but the level of the treachery that Oromov is going to pull off here, because there's all these fail-safes in place, and they had to have an inside man to be able to steal the GoldenEye, so that's how Yanis went to Oromov in the first place. So it's fun seeing all the machinations. We have the security card that has to come from Oromov, then we have to have the commander of the base do the handprint scan, and then we have to go over to the safe, and we have all these various things that have to be done, of course, before everyone gets killed. And, of course, it's always fascinating seeing bits of business like this as an audience, because it's drawing you to the story, you don't quite know what's going on, and it's building anticipation. So, again, there's a number of nice reveals in the film that you don't know are coming the first time. But seeing Xenia and then having her literally massacre everyone, it just totally makes her revealed as the villainess. But for the first time, the villainess is really turned on by the events on screen. And Famke Janssen just sells that so vividly. And all we need is a silent reaction from Gottfried Drahn as Oromov to just really convey, boy, this lady really is messed up. I get to see the Goldeneye being prepared for the first time with the disc and the 2 keys. Of course, the little laser light effect going to the video wall. So the whole layout of this, it looks fantastic. It's actually designed well, which is something that I think is often lost in modern films, where they're so reliant on computer displays and things. They don't think about making things look cool anymore. So it's great that even the Goldeneye device and the satellite program in the video wall has its own sort of identity. And the other cool thing is the satellite is disguised as a piece of floating space junk because, of course, no one knew the Goldeneye existed. As we get later in the MI6 briefing scenes, M saying, nobody thought they could build it. They didn't have the money. They didn't have the facilities for doing it. Well, joke's on you, they did. Lucky for Natalia, she felt like she needed a coffee break, but the distraction gives enough time for the alarm to go off, so that's why we get the appearance of the MiGs, but Oromov wonderfully knows their response time, so of course they'll be late. And again, this sequence still has incredible model work with the various jets going on and then eventually crashing into the station itself and the dish outside. And of course, it's great that the villains are actually intelligent. So, you see the open hatchways and you fires. She gives that little moan of pleasure, that really just off-putting moment. And then has the great cold one-liner, had to ventilate someone. But it's not the traditional Bond one-liner. That's very dark, and coming after that scene, and she's revealed as not just psychopathic, but she enjoys it. And then we have the approach of the Goldeneye satellite. The countdown timer is already going, and Sarah's score is extraordinarily sort of brooding and very low in the mix. And now, wonderful transition shot from the moving MiGs to double-decker bus, and then this great little moment of Bond literally wandering around MI6. We see the new MI6 design for the first time, M's new office, but that sort of movement is my favorite little bit of Terry Rawlings' editing. I think it perfectly matches what he's doing in a lot of the cutting. That nice cutting on movement, and then cutting from the movement outside to Bond moving inside. Now we see the new Moneypenny, played by Samantha Bond, having this wonderful ability to byplay the traditional Bond Moneypenny banter. Well, with a nice edge, she has the line about sexual harassment, sort of playing on the modernized workplace and things, but having the traditional Bondian element underneath. We're finally getting to see the traditional banter again, but the banter itself is modernized just enough to let you know, once again, the film itself is self-aware of the change in times. And in Goldeneye, I think it's the one time where they actually have fun with it a little bit. And they do this by keeping Bond as the constant in this world. Here we have Michael Kitchen as Bill Tanner, who I think does an amazing job with, unfortunately, not very much screen time at really selling the classic Bill Tanner character from Fleming's novels as M's chief of staff and really Bond's best friend in the service. I love the sort of beleaguered feel he has because, of course, at this point, M is the new M, and played by Judi Dench, who basically turned this role into a new tenure and really is the person most identified with the role now outside of the iconic Bernard Lee. And of course, making M a Woman was inspired by Stella Remington being the head of MI6 at the time of the film's production. And, I think it was a fine idea. And we get the office scene in this briefing scene here where, again, it's a sort of firm reminder of, again, the world has become modernized, but Bond himself has stayed the same. This is giving us a bit of the plot, setting up what Goldeneye is, the idea that it's a giant EMP, it's a first strike weapon, and that Severnaya was thought to, not house Goldeneye, that it didn't actually exist. M gets in some one-liners of her own, the line particularly about not getting bad news from CNN like the American government, giving her some guts and some an ability to toss it right back at Bond and cut him down to size, as any M absolutely has to do. Unfortunately, Natalia has stayed under the cabinet for a number of minutes and didn't decide to leave earlier, so she'll be stuck inside. I love that she's looking around, and of course she's traumatized by what's happened, and then only then does she look at the clock right as it starts to run out. But we get that nice little whirring siren. We get the close-up right as the timer runs out. The editing builds up beautifully in alternating close-ups. They get closer and closer. Sound drops out, and then we get the first blast of the Goldeneye. And then I love that once it goes through, then everything gets quiet, and then we start to see the little sparks go off. Of course, the sparks are primarily digital effects, but they did have to be, placed individually, as this was still, very early in the digital effects era. But everything else is still practical. The set's literally blown to hell. And while this sequence does kind of go on for a bit, it is nicely intercut with the briefing room, and particularly here when we cut back and then the whole screen goes white. I particularly love that moment because, of course, the entire MI6 briefing room and Bond is having to react just as the audience is. And then they have to piece together what's happened, and this allows them to confirm the fact that Goldeneye really does exist because nothing else could do that effect. So the moment they hold, the planes collide, and only then does the second one explode. And, of course, the Tiger was the perfect way to steal the Goldeneye because, of course, it is designed to withstand the electronic battlefield. So, of course, you'd think once the Tiger was stolen, somebody would be trying to do something with it because of that. So it makes sense that it would suddenly show up and Severnaya would get destroyed. Natalia's not having a very good day today at work. If you pay very close attention there's a little bit of the sound effect and the collapsing walls and things, a little bit of that sort of stressed metal effect that goes all the way back to at least Moonraker. I like that we do get to spend this time of Natalia sort of grieving for her dead friends and, covering the bodies up. And it gives a little bit of breathing room, allows her character to sort of process this. And Sarah starts to lay in a nice little dramatic cue. I really like the bit here where she goes to the door and tries to open it. And, of course, obviously the panel's fried. She's just essentially freaking out at this point a little bit. It feels very natural. And then this builds to the nice little jump scare moment when the ceiling collapses behind her. And again, this is Isabella Scorupco really in the shot. It is a practical effect, and it's definitely not. It was definitely a one-take thing. Literally collapsing the whole ceiling and having the lead actress right there in the frame. The zoom in on her face is definitely a little dramatic, but it's a nice little moment, and then she sees her ability to escape. And I love that we get a sense of her having to struggle to survive. So it's definitely then believable why Orumov would think that she was dead along with everyone else. Now Sarah's experience of love theme comes to the fore for the first time. And then she remarkably starts going around obviously calling for Boris, because, of course, he hopefully is the only other person who escaped. This constant cross-cutting back and forth between Severnaya and MI6 is, again, it's definitely atypical for a Bond film. Goldeneye is not cut traditionally, and of course, that we get the M briefing scene after this sequence. It's actually, coming into the film quite late. Traditionally, the M briefing scene would be at the head of the film. So Goldeneye is adhering to the Bond formula, but it's playing around with it. And it's self-aware. So it's toying with things, it's pushing them and pulling them around in different fashions, and doing all this within the context of the mid-90s post-Cold War era. Again, some more plot exposition to explain exactly what an EMP does, and a little bit of the backstory historically, which I appreciated being there. It's not too much. It's just enough to get it across to the audience, but also with just enough historical context to make it feel much more like a spy story. It's similar to what we get when we get the backstory of Yanis and Zukovsky talking about it being a Leon's Cossack, and we get the explanation of that back history. It gives it a nice bit of gravitas and real-world feel. It makes it feel a bit more realistic. And Bond is able to plug in information here. He's talking about there had to be an insider because, as he says, I know the Russian failsafe codes. You can't just walk in. And again, it is Bond who notices the survivor, of course, turns out to be Natalia. And he zooms in closely, and we see the ghostly figure of her, her body heat signature from the satellite view. Again, nice cross-cutting back. And then Natalia just happens to stumble across a team of sled dogs, which proves to be her salvation because there's otherwise no transportation. She's obviously not dressed for the landscape. You have to wonder why these dogs are there. You can't really see it in the film, and I don't know if it was shot, but you see the crash sled there. John Gardner's novelization explains she takes a second to put on a thick coat, and earlier there had been a scene where the man driving the sled dog team had crashed and had been killed, so that's why they're sitting there. Now here is the traditional M office scene, which really becomes the point at which the film outright, pierces the, no pun intended, the perceived image of Bond, and we get the sexist, misogynist dinosaur line. If you look at Brosnan's acting in this scene, it is really deeply nuanced, deeply felt. It's probably my favorite moment in the entire film. And the way he reacts to M, because again, this is a new M. Bond doesn't really know how he feels about her yet. They don't have an established dynamic. And as evidenced by the bean counter line and the evil queen of numbers, the entire office and staff doesn't know how to perceive this M yet. She seems very much different than the traditional M figure, but reveals herself to be much different from her perceived notion. You see the coldness in Bond's face. He talks about the analysts that said his instincts were not worth following, going after the Tiger helicopter, for example. So we get a sense of Bond's frustration with the new world and the new realm. It's not overt, but it's there, and it's felt. And there, of course, is the line. Again, it's a bit on the nose, but it is there for a reason, and M is laying her cards out on the table. Bond has to mull over it. This is the point at which M kind of earns Bond's respect to a tad. You can see it in his face. It's Bond's reactions, particularly in the close-ups, the way that Brosnan handles this. I like the nice push-in when M leans forward and literally gives the mission objective. And then, of course, the line about the vendetta, I have to think, was maybe a nod to License to Kill. The way that he says never after she says don't make it personal. It's that governments change, the lies stay the same. There's a world of experience behind those eyes. And then the scene closes with M allowing one flash of humanity come back alive, and Bond just takes it, no dialogue, nothing needs to be said. Everything is understood, and that's the moment where the Bond-M dynamic really starts for the Brosnan era. We have the setup and the role reversal of M being a woman and things like that, but it's nicely set up and pulled off. And again, that is probably my favorite moment of acting in the entire film. It's very, very simple, but there's many layers going on there, and you get such a great sense of Bond's character. Now we have how briefings go in the Russian government at the time. And if you look over here on the side, there is the fellow on the left with the mustache and glasses. And that, of course, is the film's co-producer, Michael G. Wilson, making his traditional cameo. One of his biggest because, of course, as I say in the commentary, where it's he and Martin Campbell having a wonderful chit-chat back and forth. He gets a couple nice close-ups. Campbell couldn't resist because, of course, Michael is sort of paying the bills as the co-producer. So it's one of his most notable appearances in the film. So it's really kind of started. He, of course, doubled for Oddjob and Goldfinger, but his cameos really kind of started. You can spot him in The Spy Who Loved Me, but he's also in Spy, and then in Moonraker, and then it just kind of became a tradition of sorts in there that continues to this day. As Defense Minister Mishkin, we have the wonderful Cheikh Kerio, who, of course, had been in several Luc Besson films, where, of course, were scored primarily by Eric Serra, and that's where the producers thought he would be a perfect choice after films like La Femme Nikita and Leon the Professional. And they, of course, were two films very much of the Euro thriller movement that came to dominate a lot of films in the 1990s, and I feel Goldeneye really follows in that trend. It's not a Euro thriller, but it sort of has that feel of a Euro thriller. If you've seen a lot of European-based action and thrillers of the early to mid-1990s, that's sort of the themes and the feel of films that were flying around in the era of the early to mid-90s. And so now we move directly into the most beloved moment of the classical Bond film, Q's Lab. And Desmond Llewellyn always has such a joy of performance in his eyes. But with Brosnan, it's changed a little bit. Of course, Desmond is, 6 years older, but is definitely with Brosnan, you get the feel of Q being the beloved grandfather figure with the, slightly irascible, slightly, flippant, grandson of sorts. So we have the traditional dynamic that started really in Goldfinger, but it's changed and developed here a bit more. And he has, particularly with Brosnan, the most overtly warm Bond-Q relationship. It's always interesting to see how Desmond plays off of each of the Bond actors. And, of course, everybody and their brother had to come up with cute gags to fill out Q's lab, which really became, you see it in the background of Goldfinger, but it really didn't hit its stride in terms of being an audience favorite until The Spy Who Loved Me, where it became a must. One of my favorites of all time there is the poor fellow who gets crushed by the airbag in the phone booth. The X-ray document scanner being wonderful for foreign embassies. Now we get introduced to the most useful gadget in the film, the grenade pen. And, of course, they make this scene look so easy, and it's extraordinarily hard to do. Of course, Desmond was known for not being good with gadgets and not being very good with all the technical dialogue. But, of course, seeing the films, you would never know it. But being able to play Bond in these scenes and sell the right elements of bemusement without overplaying it, without losing one's cool, it's very difficult to do. And here they establish a dynamic that is going to last through the next two films. And I have to admit, it's the gag with the sandwich is one everybody remembers, but it actually is kind of sort of right out of Never Say Never Again when they have their version of the Q scene played for laughs very well, but it ends with the same gag, but over that Q's inhaler for his sinuses. I love this transitional moment, Bond arriving on what was once enemy turf in St. Petersburg. We get the very atmospheric Eric Serra cue, and then for the first time in many, many years, we get an actual spy code phrase recognition, which, of course, harkens back to For Much With Love. But in fitting with the real world, Bond's contact, Jack Wade of the CIA, has no use for the passcodes, and it's just like, oh, you got to be kidding me. So it's fun to see even the spycraft get a little mocked, and Bond seems a little old hat, as everyone would say. But of course, he's not going to take that lying down and has to get real confirmation. And I do enjoy the fact that Bond and Wade's actual relationship is set up on a note of danger. And there's a little bit of fun humor there because, of course, show me the rose. We don't know what that is. But you see the smile creeping into Bond's face a little bit. And Wade is embarrassed a little bit by having to strip down somewhat and show the tattoo on his buttock. Also, the way that Brosnan literally does the muffy delivery, sort of questioning. And then, of course, stiff-ass Brit. The joke about gardening is a little obscure, but of course, Wade was reading a magazine about gardening, so apparently he is a gardener in his spare time. Now, another little bit about Natalia here. She's looking over her shoulder. She knows she's obviously, a marked woman. Gardner goes into a lot more in the novelization a bit about her getting to St. Petersburg and looking over her shoulder and, having to use only cash and how she's got to figure out how to contact Boris and all that stuff. Gives some extra insight into her character and that she is an intelligent person and is, struggling to, obviously, she fears for her life. But you only get little flashes of that in the film, which I think is kind of unfortunate. And I love the fact that Wade drives a crappy old, I believe it's a Trabant, and has to pull over and, fix it. And Bond is standing there in front of a broken down old crappy car that ultimately has to be fixed by just hitting it with a sledgehammer. But in doing this, Wade is able to set the score and set the table and introduce Zukovsky, which gets the beautiful payoff of Bond knowing the name. You know him. I gave him the limp. This is a very small cue that Sarah does, but it's probably one of my favorites in the whole score. It's very atmospheric. Again, the score is always dialed back in the mix, but I keep going on about it because it just gets just torn apart everywhere. It's not the traditional score. It doesn't follow the John Barry style, but even as a John Barry fanatic, as I've been my whole life, I appreciate the Sarah score as an experiment, and it does fit this sort of self-aware feeling of a Bond film, and it being a little experimental and maybe a little bit arty in places. It fits that sort of Euro thriller vibe that the tone is going for, the style of the film. So I think it works. If you listen to it on disc, it's a bit much in places if you're just listening to it without it being in the film. But I do think it works, and I can't imagine the film without it. But I can understand why some people would have so many issues with it. And of course, we're introduced to Boris again. We don't know that he's working with Yanis, although in the background you can see the first glimpse of what's obviously the missile train and the little computer radar room inside the other train car. We just think he's somewhere, and obviously he just literally lives online, so Natalia has to find a way to contact him, because he obviously will be her only method of assistance. And this is, right out of classical, spy thriller material. So it definitely has that feeling of being a spy thriller. And this scene driving to Zhukovsky's establishment and building Zhukovsky as a dangerous character in Bond's back history with him, it builds a nice anticipation. What you don't get, though, there should be an extra scene here of seeing a sort of arms deal going on and setting up the whole bit that comes up later about Kirov's funeral parlor, because Bond has a backup plan. Wade will, come charging in with cavalry if Bond doesn't come out after a certain point. And also, he set up the deal to where Zhukovsky's men will get away with all the money and the other guy will be captured because Wade will bring the cops to the supposed arms meet. So that's how Bond, he gives himself insurance. He doesn't just go into Zhukovsky's place without insurance and a backup plan, because James Bond would not do that. He wouldn't just, brute force his way in somewhere. So unfortunately, that's missing. So we don't really get the full extent of Bond's planning, and we don't know exactly what that means. Because again, there should be an extra little scene there. But I think they just wanted to get. In the commentary, they talk about the second act. They really thought it kind of dragged in places. They had to work hard to get it to sort of pick up pace. So I think they wanted to get to Natalia getting spooked and then captured much quicker. It's a nice atmosphere, her being in this place of worship and things. And then, of course, we see Xenia appear behind Boris, so we know immediately where his allegiances lie. Now, here you see the cut scene where Zhukovsky meets with a arms dealer who tries to sell him a bunch of counterfeit weapons that are practically worthless, and how he deals with them. So that was a nice little scene to establish Zhukovsky, but honestly, I can understand why they dropped it, because the line here where he gets to rattle off the PPK, believe I've killed 2 of the men. Nice little flash of a Mexican standoff. It's a wonderful introduction, so you really don't need that scene with the gun dealer. Now here we have Minnie Driver cameoing as Zhukovsky's mistress, singing a horrendously off-tune Russian variation of Stand By Your Man, complete with backup singers and horribly distorting speakers in the background of this confrontation with someone who obviously has wished Bond dead for many, many years. My knee aches every single day. But the layer of humor, the strangling the cat line, just the whole setup of this sequence with the off-key Stand By Your Man in the background is one of the most sublime bits of humor, I think, in the entire Bond series. It's one of my favorite moments in the whole series. And then we get Zhukovsky pumping bullets into the literally almost as if he's going to shoot Bond's crotch or his knee, which he alludes to later. But even Zhukovsky can't take it and tells her to take a hike. And amusingly, in the commentary, they talk about how they had to go and specifically record a terrible-sounding version of the song, and they had to make sure it wasn't too terrible, and there were some attempts that were apparently even worse than what we get in the film. I love Bond's flippancy when he just walks in here. He's already been shot at and just mouths off, "I want you to do me a favor." Now, Robbie Coltrane as Zhukovsky does an amazing job, and it's so unfortunate he's only in this one sequence. So of course they did bring him back for The World Is Not Enough, but I don't think the character's anywhere near as effective in his second appearance. But just the backstory and the sort of back history that he has with Bond, that Zhukovsky is able to recognize that Bond essentially did spare his life for some unknown reason, and although he's harbored resentment towards him all these years, that he can recognize this, and that they have a back history that becomes a sort of relationship. So it really becomes one of the most fascinating Bond allies in a long time, and sort of is this film's version of a Kerim Bey, or especially a Columbo from 40 Rise Only. As I alluded to before, here we get the back history of who Yanis is supposedly. We get the first appearance of the Jens Cossack story. And so obviously Zhukovsky being the chief competition of Yanis in the era of the Russian mafia in the 1990s and various factions struggling for power and such, he would know about his competition. I especially love the way that Brosnan reacts and does his line deliveries in this scene, and Coltrane matches him perfectly. This, along with the confrontation scene in Statue Park coming up shortly, and also all the scenes between Bond and Trevelyan, the dialogue back and forth, they're the most rewarding in terms of performance. And you even see Bond get a little bit defensive, when he hears about the British betrayal of the Lien's Cossacks, not exactly our finest hour. It's just wonderfully delivered. Ruthless people, they got what they deserved. So Bond tries to first appeal to Zhukovsky's, nationalism, by saying, Yanis stole a nuclear weapon, killed a lot of innocent Russians, wasn't just stealing a helicopter. But then, of course, appeals to his wallet and gets Zhukovsky to set up this deal with Yanis. There's another touch that's in the Gardner novelization that I love. So you can pick up here that Bond is obviously waiting for Yanis or the Yanis representative to come in, and so he's just swimming around. He knows somebody's going to come in, but in the novelization, he actually hangs a do not disturb sign so nobody else comes in. And then it goes into more detail about how he watches the steam break when Xenia has moved through, so he knows someone has gone through. So that's why he appears so nonchalant. And it's, when you really examine the scene, it's, of course, really freaking cool. Bond looks over, he sees the steam has parted and it starts to go back together, so he knows somebody has passed through, that obviously the agent of Yanis has arrived. But he still kept swimming anyway. He can figure out exactly where they are, grabs her by the wrist to pull her in, and already has the PPK ready. And of course, the one-liner about safe sex is not only hysterical, I think, but also, again, it's a very self-aware line for the time period. The humor of the line is, of course, because by this point we know that Xenia is completely nuts, and so I don't think she possibly has a notion of safe sex. And once she bites Bond's lip and totally gets carried away, he feels the blood. He knows that obviously this is not going to be the usual sort of romp. And I love that they get very close, and she enjoys toying with Bond, but they really physically get into it. They did have to use some doubles in this scene, and they did pad the walls with rubber tiles so they could really get, bashed around. And I think right there you get when Xenia wraps her thighs of doom around Bond, I think you get the first real moment of what's now commonly referred to by fans as the Pierce Brosnan pained face, where he gets the contorted pain in his face, and you see his teeth, and you hear the wails and things. But he's able to turn the tables on the situation and do it with the requisite amount of charm and pay off the safe sex line with the no more foreplay. And once again, Xenia gets to let off a nice, frustrated curse. Now, immediately we go into the Statue Park scene, and I love this a little bit. The car comes in quietly. It's very ominous on this incredible location. And then Bond is revealed in darkness. We see the PPK coldly trained in on Xenia, who's, of course, extremely pissed off for being caught. Once again, the pleasure was all yours. The fun bit, if you'll understand, if I don't call, I won't lose sleep over it. And then Bond gives her a vicious chop to the neck, which is off screen. Again, probably to appease censors. But I have to wonder if, him knocking her out is why it takes so long for the whoever was shooting the dart. So I assume it's supposed to be Xenia, so she has to come to and be like, oh, where did I put the tranquilizer gun? And then find a place. But of course, you have to wait for the dramatic beat once the speech after Trevelyan's reveal to Bond has taken place. Now, of course, this is Statue Park, where we see all of the various emblems of the old Soviet Empire sort of literally resting around as a graveyard. And Michael France was inspired by actually being in places like this. So this is something that apparently goes all the way back to the initial Michael France drafts of the screenplay. And I have to mention the whole bit about the Lien's Cossack and backstory of Trevelyan and that being in World War II in 1945. it doesn't necessarily make sense with 006's age and being a contemporary of Bond, because originally in the screenplay drafts, Trevelyan was, in his 60s and was much more of a sort of a mentor-like figure to Bond originally. And so in the course of the rewrites and things, they essentially made them the same age and made them contemporaries. And you still have the backstory of the Leon Cossack and stuff, and the end of World War II, but it doesn't necessarily jibe with Sean Bean being, obviously same age as Bond. So there's a little bit of disconnect there, which I've always sort of picked up on, and you think about it in your head, and you're like, how does that work exactly? But again, that's just sort of a holdover from originally the character was much older. And then, of course, he is revealed in the light, and we see the scarred face from the pre-title sequence where Bond changed the timer, and that, of course, is the physical manifestation of the Janus name. But again, all the dialogue here, the weightiness of it, particularly all these lines that Trevelyan has, it's the same thing we got in the M sequence. And with Zukovsky earlier, they're cutting Bond down to size. They're piercing through the veneer and the armor and things. And I mean, Trevelyan's dialogue, it makes sense from his viewpoint, but they're wonderfully worded bits of dialogue. James Bond, Her Majesty's Loyal Terrier, defender of the so-called faith. Did you ever ask why, James? Why? Why we toppled all those regimes, toppled all those dictators, only to come home and sorry, little boy, everything you'd risk your life and limb for has changed. And I especially love the notion of back from the dead, no longer an anonymous star on the memorial wall at MI6. Imagine there literally is a memorial wall in MI6 with the anonymous stars every time somebody dies. Again, you can feel the weighty quality. Again, as with Bond, in Trevelyan, you can feel this seething sentiment of just pure rage and vitriol that not only fueled his entire backstory, but fuels him as the villain, and all these years being Janus and being one of the top evildoers in the new Russia, and being this mysterious figure. And of course a little bit of revenge, because of course he blames Bond for his scarring and such. And Bond is processing this and having to deal with all the years of grief that he felt for his supposed friend. So now that has become betrayal, and he's having to process all this in just a split second and take in who Alec really is, and all of his barbs at not just MI6 in England, but Bond himself. And it ends with the reference back with closing time, James, last call, and Bond knows exactly what's going to happen, but Alec beats him to the punch, and before Bond can fire, that's when the dart hits him. And then in a beautiful mirroring of the pre-title sequence, we get a shot from below, Alec looming over, "For England, James." And then another beautiful edit where the sound literally wakes us up with Natalia screaming, and of course Isabella really did scream herself hoarse, apparently. And I especially love the line that always cracks me up is the "hurry up or we're gonna die." And of course, she is maybe a tad annoying in the scene, but of course is freaking out. But of course, any fan of Goldeneye, and any person who grew up playing the Nintendo 64, masterpiece game of this, based on the film, it definitely takes many years to not be resentful of Natalia because of all the times she in the game would cross in front of enemy fire or do something stupid and cause you to fail the mission. I love the way the sequence builds. It does mix digital and practical effects, and of course the missiles are being used to destroy the Tiger, so destroying evidence and Bond and Natalia with it. But I love the way that Sarah's score starts to come in, the intensity builds, we get more close shots on Brosnan's eyes, and then literally Bond having to use his head to hit the eject button. And then we finally get a breather when the music dies down and the dual parachutes come out. Again, mixing in practical and digital effects really, really well, and it's a nice little sequence that still plays very well in a home theater environment. And of course, the force of the blast gives Bond enough wiggle room to get out of the restraints. And then the most amusing part of the sequence is Bond rescues them, gets Natalia out, and what does she do immediately but kick him and try to run away? And then now they're immediately picked up by the Russian army. You have to wonder how they got there so fast, or if they were tipped off or something. But some people have complained that Natalia, stays in the same outfit from Severnaya for, the majority of the movie. But you do have to keep in mind it's, only been like maybe a day at most, and she's really having the worst 24 hours of her life. So there is a greater degree of realism here. And of course, most Bond films do sort of take place over just the time frame of just a few days. Another wonderful Peter Lamont designed set that really sells this as being, the interrogation room inside the Russian facility. And this is really the major scene for Bond and Natalia in terms of establishing character and what's going to be their relationship. And Bond has to get her on his side and doesn't even get the time to, give her his name. And so he shows her what he knows, and culminated by pointing out her watch was frozen the exact time of the Goldeneye blast. And so he appears to her as this mysterious, dashing figure who apparently knows all about her. So she decides to relent and give him some information, but you notice that she doesn't name Oromov. She names Boris first. And she's still scared for her life. She doesn't want to give away too much information because, of course, she doesn't know who Bond is at this point. So there's a nice bit of back and forth, and she's starting to sort of realize that maybe Bond is on her side. But again, they're cut off. They're not given enough time before Mishkin bursts through the door. But it does give her and the audience a little breathing room. And it's the first moment where they start to have a sort of relationship. You see her smile a little bit and say, "I don't even know your name," which, of course, is then answered by Mishkin. Again, it's unfortunate that Checky Cario gets so little to do as Mishkin, because I like what he does. I like the way he carries himself. And, this could have been another sort of General Pushkin or General Gogol character for Bond to interact with throughout the rest of the Brosnan tenure, but unfortunately just wasn't to be. Because, of course, he's, he doesn't even make it through the end of the scene. And we get this nice back and forth where Bond is not taking any quarter in the barbs going back and forth and is not giving any ground in terms of this being an interrogation. Because apparently, even though they've been caught alive, it's an open and shut case to the Russian government. The Boys with Toys line is something that will get repeated later on. It's another one of the memorable lines from the film. It's maybe, I never minded it, but I know some people do. But it makes sense coming from Natalia, and she's not involved in in intergovernmental politics or espionage at all, and it sort of cuts to the bone of the scene that's going on. And that quiets both of them, and then when she reveals Oromov's participation, that's what gets Mishkin to be quiet and pay attention. You see it in his eyes. And then we get this nice little, "You were saying something, Mr. Bond, about the lost art of interrogation," Again, it suggests what could have been if Mishkin stayed on as a recurring character. And I like that Oromov appears back in the film, and he's obviously ruffled. His face is kind of sweaty, and he's very charged. And he has to just walk into the scenario, pick up Bond's gun, and then immediately kill the guard and Mishkin, which, reveals himself to Bond as the traitor for sure. And also casts his lot in completely with Hiatus, because now he's got to go on the run even from his own people. But I like that he sort of just comes into the room, takes charge, and now he's piecing it together. He says, James Bond shot while trying to escape, and he's coming up with the way that it would go down in a report. So this goes into the next major action sequence of the film, where we see Brosnan and his Bond getting to wreak havoc with a stolen AK-47. The only thing about this sequence I've always wondered about is, if you really stop to think about it, Bond is just mowing down, Russian soldiers who are, just doing their job. So it seems just a tad bloodthirsty. I mean, obviously they are, under the command of General Roumavov, but it's not necessarily, they're not. They're not necessarily bad guys, so it's a little, but maybe I'm just stretching the point too far. And then we get the classic gag of slamming the door shut with the library shelves in the archive, pulling back the armor plating, not only showing us the giant window Bond will smash through to get out of this sequence, but also establishing all the tanks and military vehicles set outside, and the platform he's going to have to land on, because otherwise he would hit the ground and possibly risk death. And I love the fact that Natalia knocks over the files. That's what sets off sets their location. And now it also brings in the the alternate music that was performed by John Altman instead of Eric Serra. And so, most people know that he was brought in very last minute to redo the score for the tank chase, because what Serra provided, which you can hear on the soundtrack, was ultimately rejected, not just by the producers, but the director and the editor as well. But Altman's cue actually starts here. So as soon as you hear that triangle for the first time, that's where his music is first spotted. And it does feel much more traditional Bondian. It does work. And then we get this beautiful moment of Bond using Q's grappling hook belt and then smashing through a massive amount of sugar glass. And of course, that I believe was also a record at the time for largest, stuntman smashing through single pane of glass. Nice building of the music, Bond having to piece together how he's going to get out, how he's going to get Natalia back and stop Ourumov, how he's going to get away from the Russian army, which is just piling in as they speak. And of course, the whole notion of the tank chase is literally just winging it. So we get the fun gag of Bond looking over, seeing the T-55 Russian tank. Now we get the delay, now we get the build-up, and now we see the wall. Tank smashes through, and this is another one-take shot because you can't possibly repeat it. So it was very difficult to set up and pull off, and with the full Bond fanfare coming in, it's one of the iconic moments that everybody remembers and one of the essential showstoppers for a Bond film. And originally this was all going to be filmed in St. Petersburg, amazingly, but they did wind up going back and actually shooting it outside the studio. So this becomes yet another just complete testament to Peter Lamont's production design, because it's absolutely seamless, and you have to think about it. I don't know how in the heck they were going to do all of this in St. Petersburg to begin with, especially, the tank smashing through the building and such. So there is a little bit of that. They did send the second unit out, but it just proved logistically so difficult with the bureaucracy in the government, but also for safety reasons, because everybody there had to have bodyguards. It was not the... as other films who shot there in the 1990s found out, it was not the most easiest place to shoot in for many reasons, but particularly safety was one of those. So, of course, you shoot on a controlled lot, you can literally, blow the whole thing to hell. You can do the tank through anywhere. And you also get little bits here and there that suggest, Bond is definitely having to think on his feet because he's not a tank driver. So he's having to, figure out how everything works. And, of course, it is a little bit, having to suspend disbelief because, of course, a real tank driver would have to put, earphones on due to the noise. And, you see Bond having to poke his head out because, of course, you only have a little slit to drive the tank. It's another little bit in Gardner's novelization I really like, where he has Bond put on earphones and have to figure out how to drive the tank. So, like with most novelizations, there are nice little bits of drama that add to the realism, but you can pick up on that stuff here. And Bond is having to figure out how to navigate this big, bulky, old Russian T-55 tank, around St. Petersburg, and he can't obviously go over the bridge that can't handle a tank, so he's having to go around. And we get the addition of humor by all of the opposing forces, not only being unable to stop a tank, but now having to throw the car into reverse. So there's a little touch of the sort of inherent humor of, say, the Diamonds Are Forever Las Vegas car chase that happens, in the middle of the film, right about like it is the tank chases in Goldeneye. So I think really the precursor to the Goldeneye tank chase is the Las Vegas chase in Diamonds Are Forever with all the cop cars getting smashed. But this does have the Bondian element because you have Bond perfectly attired in suit, still unstoppable in a tank. Although when you see the tank go over the cars, you have to think there's no way somebody could survive. We do get to see them, so they get out. And it's like, oh no, he didn't kill anybody, but it sort of beggars belief a little bit when you see the entire car get demolished. And coming up, a bit of product placement with the Perrier truck. Originally, they wanted to have like a Coke or Pepsi truck, but, surprisingly, everybody said no, so it's Perrier instead. And then that takes us into the winged statue being hoisted atop the tank, another blast of Bond fanfare, and with the actual statue charging, it's sort of a physical manifestation of Bond as St. George the Knight, unstoppable, and Ormov is increasingly freaking out at this point, hitting the hip flask, and it's like literally now he has a winged figure of justice pursuing him. And of course, the final gag that halts the police forces following Bond is they're being trapped by the statue. And then smashing into the back of the tank, which not only gives Bond a chance to clear the rubble off the top, but provide a perfectly timed tie adjustment gag. And then we have that nice soloed triangle, which is very, very dramatic as we get to the missile train. So, of course, we don't know where we are, and now we see Zinnia jump out, so now we know, obviously, this is where Yanis is holed up. And the mentioning before by Wade and Zukovsky about Yanis hanging out on a missile train, well, now that's, put in front of us visually. And I love that Bond has traced them there, sees them getting on the train, knows that's where Trevelyan is, and now he's going to circle around so he can get to lower on the track and ambush the train. So again, it's giving Bond some ingenuity, allowing him to use his instincts and come up with a way to one-up Alec. And so then it becomes the game of chicken once the train gets to the point they see the tank and decide to play Bond's game and ram the tank, which Bond seemingly already knows is probably what Alec is going to do. And that makes all of their interactions all the more interesting and dramatic because, of course, each one has a perfect reading of the other's character, or so they think, because, of course, by the end of the film, we know, obviously, that, Alec's reading of Bond is not entirely accurate. I love the ornate coach that Alec has set up for himself, obviously an old Russian head of state coach. The only thing, though, that I've always felt like Bond must have known a shortcut because the tank definitely gets ahead of the train pretty quickly. But, of course, there must be checkpoints, and it takes a while for the train to get up to speed. And now we have this interesting little note where Alec decides to enjoy the spoils of war, and the line, "James and I shared everything." It's a nice sort of feeling that he's the dark mirror reflection of what Bond could be, which I think was the whole idea of why they went with 006 being the villain, being Bond's equal in every way except for he decides to, work for himself. And of course, we always prominently see his, MI6 Rolex sorry, I should say Omega, which of course comes into play later in the film because of course he still knows where Q hides all of the gadget switches because of course he still wears his original Q branch Omega. And if you pay attention, Zinnia is literally turned on by the fact that Bond is going to derail us. It's also a nice moment because Bond is literally playing the game of one-upmanship, calling Alec at his own game, and he literally fires a shell at the train, which ostensibly could kill everyone, including Natalia, but he does it anyway. He weighs out the risks, and he knows that's the best way to derail the train, to throw everyone off balance, to then be able to get inside the train and get the drop on Trevelyan. Because, as Trevelyan points out in just a moment, Bond is outnumbered, he's outgunned, he has no backup plan. That bed standing up, Natalia does have some sense of self-preservation, as we've seen before, but is too slow and is caught by Ormov. Why can't you just be a good boy and die is the motto of every Bond villain. But you see the coldness in Bond here and in Brosnan's performance. You first, you second. Now, although Trevelyan as a character was originally written as much older, what Sean Bean does with the performance, the little nuances he gives, the bits of enjoyment that Trevelyan gets in the film. So here, Bond has the drop on him, so Trevelyan is having to try and outwit him and psychologically manipulate him. And you see him trying various things and catching on tacks, especially, admitting that he knows what Natalia tastes like, Bond says. I wouldn't know. I would. And he plays that up. And Bond knows this because, of course, they know each other's methods. And Alec invoking their past history and trying to provoke Bond once more by, going into the mission of your friend. Bond counters this by going to Oromov and, mentioning his Leon's Cossack back history, knowing that would resonate with a Russian general. He'll betray you just like everyone else. And you see the worry come across in Oromov's eyes, but Alec has the perfect response ready. The bit about the small memorial service for Bond with a tearful Miss Moneypenny and a few tearful restaurateurs in attendance. It's just, it's one of those lines that I think is totally for fans, and I adore it. And it's just beautifully played by Sean Bean. I love the smile that keeps creeping into his face. And he knows he's got the drop on Bond, even though Bond has him literally dead to rights. He knows Bond can't bring himself to have Natalia be killed, and he knows that will give him the split second necessary to get out. But of course, you have to wonder why he would have his missile train all ready to go as a death trap. But, I guess that's just, standard villain operating procedure 101. And again, Natalia does show that she is an intelligent person and is already trying to advance the plot by, realizing that Boris is online, backing up his files, we can figure out where to go. Now we get a nice repeating of the yes sir gag from License to Kill. Don't stand here, get us out of here. And again, it must be stated that, again, the majority of the sequence is all model work. It's incredible and, seamless, really. This being Derek Medding's final film, it's really a testament to his genius as, just special effects maestro extraordinaire in the practical realm. And then the wonderful hearkening back to the pre-title sequence, with the 6 minutes, same 6 minutes you gave me, the wicked laugh. So, of course, Bond now knows immediately he's only got 3 minutes. And, of course, you would wonder why doesn't the villain automatically kill Bond, but, of course, that's the classic talking killer scenario. But also Trevelyan getting to toy with Bond and getting to get a sort of retribution by giving him only 3 minutes. But again, there's a nice tension that starts to build. We know there's a ticking clock. You can sort of feel that in Sarah's music cue with the background music starting to have a pulse. The editing starts to pick up. The speed of the dialogue starts to pick up, and Bond immediately can pick through Boris's word games, which is nice showing of Bond's quick intelligence. And then when Bond starts reading off how many seconds are left as he's burning through the floor with the laser watch, Natalia's reading off of the radar tracking gets more and more frenzied. Then we cut to Boris ripping the control boards out. So again, and now you can actually pay attention. There's actually a heartbeat rhythm that appears on the soundtrack as the music gets more and more frenzied and the heartbeat pumping starts to increase. They get out of the train, they're running, and then the fireball goes off. And of course, no stunt people. It's really the actors right there in camera frame, which of course sells any sequence. And now a nice bit of fun banter. So now Natalia is firmly won over on Bond's side. And Bond gets to throw her own Boys with Toys line back at her. And I like that the humor in this little tag scene is earned because we have the Bond having to win over Natalia, Natalia realizing, who Bond is, what his aims are, and being won over to his charms. It's not an easy thing. It doesn't just immediately happen. They don't just start, going at one another immediately. It feels earned, and they play this scene for all it's worth. We get a nice, long, slow, dissolved transition into this really gorgeous speech shot as we are finally, as Natalia says, all my life I dreamed of coming to the Caribbean. And we get to see a glimpse of the BMW Z3 Roadster, which was really introduced with this film and started the BMW licensing deal that meant Brosnan's Bond would be in a BMW for his first 3 films. Originally, we saw the gadgets being described in Q's lab, and there was to have been a car chase sequence, but ultimately, for budget and time, that was unfortunately dropped. So we just see the Z3 driving in this one sequence, and that's it. And then the plane drops overhead, and Natalia's immediately sort of, pissed off again. So Wade re-enters the picture, and he will become the Felix Leiter of Brosnan's tenure in the role. I always wondered why they didn't just make it Felix, why they created this new character, but in Goldeneye, I like what the Wade character does, and I like that he's much more believable. Although apparently he was the CIA man in Russia. Now he just acts as Bond's liaison. And they have a nice little bit of wink, wink, nudge, nudge dialogue here, back and forth. So all the stuff about Cuba and the United States not having direct involvement with Cuba, and then, establishing Natalia's identity. I love that Bond gets her name wrong, so even Bond has trouble with her name. And the head-to-toe line is one of those specific moments where you can see exactly Brosnan's strength at tossing off the one-liners with the intrinsic smile. He doesn't overplay it. He actually underplays it, but you can feel that wink. But also in the rest of this scene, he's completely dark on the surface. He's already reflecting on what he's got to do. And then we get the other great comic payoff with Wade getting in the car. Just one thing. Don't press any of the buttons on that car. I was just going to go bombing around in it. Exactly. And the final line Wade has, I have faith, but be careful. He knows you're coming. It has a finality to it. So I like its placement, and it's Wade, literally saying, "Be careful, don't die," as M does at the end of the M office scene. But it resonates with Bond, and it leads us into this beach scene, which is really Bond's character laid bare in the film, and it is, very much the core of Bond as a, part of his job is he is an assassin. He is a cold-blooded killer, but he has to live with it, and he distances himself in a lot of ways from the rest of humanity. Now, this shot is always interesting. Natalia appears, gorgeously dressed on this wonderful beach, and then she walks into frame, and we just, see her lower half, almost like her body is staring at Bond. Apparently, that was a shot that Terry Rawlings loved and insisted had to stay in, just because it was so different. Now, all this is played in close-up in this beatific setting, and again, Natalia is, reacting against Bond's cavalier attitude. Again, what M talked about earlier, and it is a defense mechanism. It is the way in which Bond carries himself, but he does have to go and kill Trevelyan. He has to stop him, and he knows he's going to wind up most likely killing him or die trying in the process, and that it was not just a friend, not just a fellow agent, but of course also someone he grieved for 9 years. And so, as is typical at certain points in most Bond stories, Bond has to once again come to terms with not just himself, but his job and the world at large. This is something that's usually internalized, and say in the original Fleming text. It's nice to see it in the film. Again, I think dialogue-wise, maybe it's a little bit on the nose. But it's nice that it's there, and it leads us into an actual romantic moment with Natalia, where we have this bed scene, and then she's going to be able to turn the we get the bit about calling their bluff. So, killer, she means nothing to me. She'll be able to turn around and throw back at him in a minute. And once we get into the final sequence in the control room, so that provides a nice bit of humor. But there is a nice sort of intimacy here. The love scenes in Bond films don't always go for intimate, and this was something that you see here first in Goldeneye and really continues throughout the Brosnan run. I think it's something they really tried to do, and they definitely went much further in attempting something deeper with the Paris character in Tomorrow Never Dies. Again, it's just unfortunate you don't really get Natalia's back history, and she does stuff in the film, and I think Scorpio's performance is great. I love her in the film as Natalia, and I love even this little bit here in the plane when she grins after Bond makes a crack. Natalia feels very much like a real a fully realized person and a real character, but I just feel as the character is very underserved by what she's given to do. It's just very perfunctory after a certain point. Again, I also point out I love the transition from the bed scene to the plane winging its way, flying under the radar, which makes you harken back to Bond traveling to Scaramanga's Island at the end of The Man with the Golden Gun. Now, of course, most of this end sequence also features incredible work by Derek Medding, so a lot of this is model work intersposed with real location footage, perfectly selling the sequence. The only thing I've always wondered about plot-wise, though, they fly over several times, and only then does a missile come out to strike the plane. But by this point, they're almost convinced that nothing's there. So you would think, wouldn't Trevelyan have let them fly over several times and then just, give up? But of course, he knows it's most likely Bond, and, anybody who flies over probably gets the same treatment. So in that sense, it's like you only live twice when Bond is in Little Nelly and flies over the volcano, and all of a sudden Spectre sends out the 4 black helicopters after him, when had they just left him to fly away, he probably wouldn't have come back because he wouldn't have been suspicious of that volcano. Wonderful effect of the plane getting totally destroyed, the wings coming off. Bond and Natalia barely survive and are realistically beat up and dazed, and then stumble out. Bond saves Natalia from the burning wreck, and then they literally just pass out. Also can't help but you see a plane in a Bond film get its wings smashed off, and you can't help but think of Live and Let Die. And I like this as a transitional moment because, again, it is believable. Bond himself would literally pass out at this point. He can do superhuman feats at times, but he himself is not a Superman. So I appreciate that Bond has believable moments of perceived weakness. And then we get this wonderful transition. Bond's eyes open slowly. We get like little flashes of slow motion. The soundtrack plays up effects. We get a Sarah Q starting to come in. And you see the sunlight, and Bond able to, and along with the audience, start to make out the rotors of a plane. We see the rope come out. Then we see the figure. And then as Bond staggers to his feet, then we see the figure rappel down the cord. So Bond is unable to react to the danger of Xenia appearing fast enough. So Bond is already dazed, battered, so he's obviously in no shape to struggle with Xenia and barely escape with his life again. So it gives us a nice bit of suspense to start the sequence, and of course Xenia is rearing to kill Bond this time. More classic Brosnan pain face, which he does better than anyone on the planet. Natalia tries to interfere, which gives Bond the opportunity to grab the AK and attach the line. Unfortunately, this sequence is over so fast that it's a great exit for Xenia, and she screams beautifully. She's really freaked out, and you can feel her terror. And, it's a very visually striking death that's, obviously very fitting and ironic that she herself is literally squeezed to death. And I like that the helicopter explodes. Bond and Talia have to dive down for, protection. But even though it's got a great payoff, I've always felt the actual fight is just too short for her being such a, iconic character, and definitely the most, dangerous henchwoman since Fiona Volpe in Thunderball. And while that scene does have a great payoff, just think about the way that Fiona was eliminated in Thunderball with that great build-up and that great scene. I just feel like Xenia doesn't get the most graceful exit. And then once she's gone, the film does lose some energy, just like after Fiona's death in Thunderball, the film loses energy. But honestly, in Goldeneye, it's not quite as obvious because the film at this point is definitely about Bond's personal journey and not just, stopping the world threat, but really stopping the personal threat and overcoming his own hang-ups and achieving some level of revenge for Alex's betrayal. There's a personal factor at play. So in certain ways, you could make the argument that Goldeneye does have some similarities to License to Kill. A lot of people have made the argument or the supposition that, Goldeneye was written for Timothy Dalton, who would have done a third James Bond film, and Cubby Broccoli and Eon did stick to their guns and offer it to him, which we did finally find out after some interviews a number of years ago that, he was offered and did think about staying on, but, enough time had passed and he would have had to do several films, and MGM as a studio really did want to go entirely new. They wanted to recast by that point anyway. So there were other things at work. I think perhaps maybe when Michael France started writing the draft, he may have had, Dalton in mind somewhat. But I don't really think any of the screenwriters really wrote with a specific Bond in mind until we get to the later writers, once pre-production had already started and they were going with Pierce Brosnan. I think by that point, particularly Bruce Fierstein as the final writer really did start sort of tailoring for Brosnan. But Goldeneye does have a darker edge. It does have more of a spy thriller vibe, and you have the direct personal revenge and betrayal of Bond connotation, which does make you think of License to Kill being a film about Bond going on a mission of revenge and a personal vendetta. So it does have some tenets of the Dalton era, and I can understand why people may think that, but it didn't exactly happen that way. But it does have some of the feel of what we got in the Dalton era. It is kind of building on that, but it's also reworking into the modern landscape of the cinematic world of the mid-90s. And of course, the target is London. Where else would it be? Now, of course, this is a real location of the radar telescope, which unfortunately, just recently, the past year or two, did actually collapse. Unfortunately, never got the chance to go there while it was still in existence. But the mixing of set footage, stage footage, real location footage, and model work is really well done. When you look at the long shots of Bond and Natalia sliding down, it's a great moment and a great visual, but if you look at it very closely, it's obviously some effects work, particularly when they catch themselves on the lip there, the long shot. But it does still really work well, and it's a great visual of seeing them slide all the way down. And it does give a little bit of a lull because obviously it looks like they were shot dead and fell down or died during the fall. Of course, ever so convenient, there's a hatch on the top for them to get into the top of the facility. Some nice product placement for Pioneer doing the video wall, because every villain layer has to have some product placement. And I like how Peter Lamont did keep some of the core ideas of the design of Seven Station in this Cuban facility. So it's the second facility that I have to assume was built by Oremov's Space Division or something, and somehow kept secret from the rest of, from Michigan and others in the Russian government. So it's got some of the same design aesthetics. So I like that even that's there. It's not as big and grandiose as some of the great villain final layers we've seen before, but it makes sense. And it makes sense because it is a covert facility, and it is ostensibly, originally built in the Soviet era. And so we now have to do the infiltration where Natalia just goes off on her own and Bond has to essentially wing it. And then here we get the key Bondian moment where Brosnan just unaffectedly is setting Q's remote mines, and then the bullet ricochet and the flash goes off right next to his head, and he simply turns his head without stopping what he's doing, without flinching. And then tosses his gun away, walks out, but obviously has a backup plan, and goes in with full confidence even though he's surrendering himself. So now we get the pullback where obviously we have the bombs, and then we see the flammable liquid, which I'm never exactly sure. It's some sort of oil or gas, I suppose, that's leaking out. So then Bond is able to know that any sort of explosion will trigger the liquid off. But he also knows Natalia's off doing something else. Of course, they didn't get to coordinate their plans, but she's going into the mainframe area, and she's going to attempt her own form of sabotage, which ultimately it turns out to be effective where Bond's is not. So it is a nice turning of the tables in terms of now it is the Bond girl who is actually going to be the one who provides the distraction and the initial foiling of the villain's plot to get them out of this scenario. So Bond has to then try and psychologically manipulate Trevelyan here and play him along long enough to hopefully be able to trigger the mines. But as soon as we hear Trevelyan say the watch, we know, this isn't going to go well. And then we get the nice shot of the two different models of Q's Omega watches. And still pressed here to eye is quite chilling when we see the mines then blink off. So along with Bond, we're able to see the full machinations of Trevelyan's plan, that not only is he going to get his revenge on England itself and strike back at the world, but also enrich himself. So it adds a nice bit of ingenious flair to the villain's plan, but also gives Bond an opportunity to insult Trevelyan and once again play out this game of back and forth attempts at psychological manipulation. Now we get the nice reveal of Natalia being captured and brought down. Trevelyan gets to stroke his ego and explain the full length of what his plan is going to cause, which leads Bond to comply with, it's going to be a worldwide financial meltdown. Also, little Alec can settle the score with the world 50 years on. And now we go to the other line that goes all the way back to the Michael France drafts, the infamous, iconic vodka martini sense that screams of all the men you've killed. Or if you find forgiveness in the arms of all those willing women for all the dead ones you failed to protect. Which is the really biting one, because, of course, that references back to Tracy and Automatic Secret Service. Inflation adjusted for 1945. So, again, that notion of the timeline doesn't exactly match up with Trevelyan's age. So that's the one holdover from him originally being an older character. I like that we get the nice little character beat of Trevelyan enjoying Boris getting punched by Natalia. But, of course, this ultimately proves to be their undoing, because Boris now has the grenade pen, and we get the first of the heightened close-ups and the actual clicking on the soundtrack. So now already we are thinking, okay, how many times did he click it? And we're going to get additional close-ups of Bond. Boris is going to he does the pen in Natalia's face, so we're seeing it, and we're already thinking, okay, did he click it 3 times? So we know the grenade pen is going to come into play, and since it doesn't happen immediately, that tension is going to start to build, and we know it's going to happen, but when is it going to happen? So eventually the audience, along with Bond, is going to be counting the clicks like mad, and everything else in the scene doesn't matter because you're just sitting there counting the clicking of the pen. And in a nice moment of character one-upmanship, Natalia is able to out-program and hack Boris's program and send the satellite to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and burn up over the Atlantic. So again, Natalia is the one who essentially foils Trevelyan's plans and not Bond. So again, it's a nice sort of way of making the Bond girl of the film much more a direct participant in the plot line, and not, hammer it over your head that, we're trying to strengthen the Bond girl character and so on and so forth. But it also remains for Bond to actually make sure that her reprogramming stays in effect. Now we go from the lingering close-up to Bond to the pen. The editing starts to pick up here. We get increasing edits, cuts. All the close-ups are in place. We don't use master shots anymore. The pacing really picks up. The intensity of the close-up goes. And then Boris drops the pen. And now we get that sort of trailing of the music from the train earlier. And then you hear the 3 clicks of the pen. Bond waits the necessary time, then knocks the pen, so then it immediately goes off and lights the oil. I felt terrible for all the poor computer programmers who are just dressed normally, who are now caught in the explosion. And Natalia is just like, oh yeah, he could possibly break my codes. A repeat of the "I'm fine, thank you very much." So we get a sort of traditional Bond moment where now the layer's being blown to hell, but it's not over yet. We still have to get to the antenna. Bond has to sabotage it before Boris can reprogram it and signal the satellite. And, of course, Bond has to settle his personal score with Trevelyan, one-on-one. And, of course, Natalia knows exactly how to use a handgun. But, of course, if Bond hadn't, if he had taken the handgun, he could have had another gun to confront Trevelyan with, but then Natalia couldn't have commandeered the helicopter. So it does play a part in Bond's eventual rescue. I love that Boris is still working in the middle of the bombed-out facility. And then another lift from the Wild Bunch. We have the, a version of if he moves, if they move, kill him. So I'm thinking Martin Campbell is a big Sam Peckinpah fan. There's another fun bit in Gardner's novelization that Bond doesn't see the cable car that Trevelyan takes, so he's running across the top, and it takes him longer, and thus Trevelyan uses the cable car and is able to head him off. Nice effect of the satellite starting to enter the atmosphere. Again, this is the point where the battle is totally personally motivated, and honestly, at this point, the whole notion of having to stop the satellite or Trevelyan having to keep the satellite moving takes a back seat to the just festering story of the personal battle going on. This is the mano-a-mano fight, and really is a direct personal confrontation between Bond and villain like we hadn't seen before, because of course this is the former 006, and so there's so much back history in their relationship and everything that's gone on that we haven't seen but has been alluded to enough in the dialogue, the interactions, and was first established in the pre-title sequence. And then in the best representation of, Bond in the modern world, still able to adapt and perform perfectly, the way he sabotages the high-tech Goldeneye satellite is by the most simple means possible of shoving an iron bar inside the gears of a machine. So it is a simplistic, actual physical item that stops all the computer tomfoolery that's going on with Boris. So Boris is literally thwarted by an iron bar. So again, it's a physical manifestation. It's a physical item that stops the high-tech weaponry. A little bit of blood there showing that, from Trevelyan's wound, that obviously he's been this way, but as we're shown later, it's actually a bit of misdirection. So Bond follows the path that he thinks Trevelyan has gone down, but then Trevelyan swings in from above. So obviously he left the blood on the rail as a means of bringing Bond to where he could get an advantage. So this is a wonderfully vicious little fight that, again, was designed to show each the former 006 and 007 at their, physical peak, and using all their training and experience, and of course the rage on each side towards the other. Bond's rage at being betrayed, and his, the rage of and the internalized guilt, and then Alec's rage against England and Bond, and his rage of feeling, just wanting to get back at the world. And they literally go for broke in this little tiny room. It is reminiscent of the From Russia with Love train fight, which is what they were going for. But even though, Alec has, the I was always better, you notice he is, more bloodied up. He is more beat up. He does manage to get the gun, but of course Bond has, as always, a backup plan, and hits the ladder latch and launches himself down. You have to think about it. It must be extraordinarily painful when the ladder reaches the bottom. So he's actually barely able to hang on. So once again, intensity builds a little bit again, but it is all built around the climax of the personal conflict that we've had throughout the entire film, that really is of, the friend and ally who really is none of those. And it's the betrayal that really, sets the entire tonality of this moment. And we see the great relish at which Trevelyan is going to enjoy finally eliminating Bond. We let the moment play out to give that extra bit of tension. And of course, here on this extremely precarious platform, there is literally nowhere to run. Fittingly, it's the distraction of the helicopter coming up, but the distraction of Natalia taking over said helicopter that provides Bond's opening, and thus, since Bond did save his friend, he did save Natalia, that is essentially what saves him in the end and dooms Trevelyan. And we get the final for England, James. No, for me. Which is the fatal mistake that Trevelyan made in reading Bond's character and not reading it correctly by thinking he knew who James Bond was just because he worked with him. I do like that Trevelyan doesn't immediately die. It's nice getting that final little last bit that he's obviously dying, but we get that nice little moment where he feels it. We get the return of Sarah's theme that we first heard outside the casino. Then Bond makes the leap for the helicopter. Nice bit of triumphant scoring as the flames tear through. Again, beautiful model work mixed in with the real location footage. And then this is, a bit silly when the whole thing just comes collapsing on Trevelyan. We get the zoom into his mouth. It's cheesy, but it's over very quickly. But yeah, it is a bit silly. What I will defend to the death, though, is Boris managing to survive as if he was Jaws, complete with a cracked eyeglass lens, and a final, I am invincible. And then the liquid nitrogen goes off from the mainframe computers, so he is essentially done in by his own beloved mainframes. And we get the beautiful image of the Boris frozen in ice, forever frozen in his invincible yet dead pose. I do like how Bond and Natalia jump out of the helicopter as essentially to just be in the middle of nowhere. They're just going to lie there. Of course, Wade and the Marines are there, but, it's kind of like, Bond gets to toss back the "yes, I'm fine, thank you." We hear the Experience of Love theme come in, which will play into the end credits. And then a final little bit of humor when we think we're going to get a traditional Goldfinger-style closeout with Bond and leading lady, embracing and fade out into black. But it's played out for humor here, where Wade suddenly appears, and you have to wonder, have they just been sitting there this whole time? Did they just wait to make sure that they were going to succeed in their mission? And then in a sort of nod to the reveal of the Mujahideen and the Living Daylights when they escape the Russian airbase the first time, the Marines are suddenly there. So a bit of knowing humor, a bit of humor between Bond and Natalia, Bond getting to crack an actual smile as we exit the film, as the Marine helicopters lift off and go off into the distance, and we see into the Experience of Love. It's a nice note to close Goldeneye out with, and it's got a nice somber quality to it that I think really fits, the final killing of Trevelyan and Bond getting over the betrayal, and also he over the course of the film he has come more to terms with his place in the post-Cold War landscape, and that's really the whole goal of the film is James Bond's arc to do that, and I think it's represented by the betrayal of Trevelyan, and Trevelyan ostensibly dying in 1986 in the middle of the Cold War, then reappearing in 95. So it's sort of all tied together. And then Derek Meddings gets a nice tribute card because, again, he unfortunately passed away after the film completed production. So his work on the film really forms a great testimony to his incredible career. And then the end credits play out over the Experience of Love end title theme song. So it's actually got lyrics over it, and it's actually apparently Eric Serra singing himself. Um, it it's always felt a little bit odd to me in terms of like it always feels weird to close a Bond song with a sort of slow paced love theme, but of course we did have that in License to Kill with If You Ask Me To, and musically it has been woven into the film score, so it fits. It's just it just. I don't know. It's just always the actual song itself has always felt a little weird in the end credits. But again, I've just become so accustomed to it, I can't picture the film without it. I think it's maybe just because the vocal just kind of sounds so not hoarse, but it's a very sort of rough main vocal. It just feels kind of weird. And apparently, the whole theme, Experience of Love, was worked out of something that was left over and not used in his score for Leon the Professional, which was actually the film that Eon really chose him after hearing that. And once they heard The Professional and they heard his score for that, for the Luc Besson film, that's who they wanted to do the score. So, of course, we're in the credits for Pioneer and Brioni taking over for Bond's tailoring. Again, this film was shot on film and edited on film, so you do get that credit in here, and that will really be the last time you get that in a Bond film. The credits for Dolby and DTS. It as it close to the film, it fits thematically, and Goldeneye did win over audiences and new audiences. So it did ultimately prove that James Bond could and did and would forever return, that the 6-year gap did not completely kill off the series. And of course, eventually it achieved a worldwide gross of over $350 million in 1995 money. So inflation adjusted, it is still very successful, completely outdid industry expectations, and also helped MGM to, become a actual producing studio that, everybody at least had some belief in again. So it saved not only the Bond franchise, but, MGM for a little bit longer. And of course, again, no one expected it to pull this feat off. So they really did do the impossible. They did what they set out to do in terms of making James Bond a believable, successful cinematic experience again. And they did capture a new generation in terms of the audience market. And this would be capitalized on, 2 years later when the iconic Rare game was released for the Nintendo 64. And so you had people who were introduced to Bond through the game, and then they went to the film, and they sort of came to the series that way. And so Goldeneye has become the sort of gateway for an entire generation of Bond fans. I myself sort of grew up in the middle of that. I had already become experienced with Bond, and then Goldeneye came out like shortly thereafter, and it was just blowing the doors open that all of a sudden this was in the pop culture landscape again, and it wasn't what felt pretty obscure at the time point in the early to mid 90s before the lead up to Christmas '95. So that ends the film, and I think Goldeneye is really a very successful film when you look at it today. I think it's actually grown over time, but it's actually a surprisingly subtle film in a lot of ways. Again, I think there's a lot of voices going on in the storytelling, and I think that goes back to the fact there were 4 screenwriters, and they were working with Eon, and everybody was sort of pushing and pulling and trying to figure out how to make a Bond film work, and nobody exactly knew how to pull this thing off. So there was some degree of nervousness for sure, and they didn't have the largest budget in the world to play around with, so they did have to stay budget-minded, and they did have to prove themselves because people didn't believe in a Bond film anymore. And so they had to overcome the stigmas that were attached. And of course, Pierce Brosnan had to prove himself in the role, and did so beautifully with great support from Martin Campbell and some really nice, nuanced texture for the Bond character on screen that I think you can really pick up on over multiple viewings over the years. And especially I do think it's a film that definitely grows with age, with some incredible model work and effects work from Derek Meddings and Chris Corbold and the rest of the regular crew. Some really incredible production design from Peter Lamont that feels so real you hardly even think about it. Again, I also think the Eric Serra score is actually quite underrated. I think it fits the whole Euro thriller vibe of the film and the sort of experimental nature of it, and trying to be Bond jumping into the 1990s. I can understand, again, why people don't like it so much, but I've always enjoyed it. And then once I bought the soundtrack and started listening to it more and more, I can understand what he was going for. And I know there was some trouble with the during the editing and post-production process, and he didn't really want to make changes, so they wound up definitely dialing it back in the sound mix, in terms of dialing the music levels down. And then they brought in John Altman, and he did his specific section for the tank chase and such. But as a score, I think it actually holds up pretty well. And, for what it was trying to do and being experimental, I really like what it did. And I can't imagine the film without it. And I think it's definitely it is part of the film's DNA. And that does, again, as I said before, I think Goldeneye does have a sort of, it's not an art film, but it is kind of experimental, but it still knows it has to hit certain beats of the Bond formula, to still be a Bond film at its core and at its heart. And it doesn't mess with the Bond character. It keeps that solid and constant, which a Bond film really has to do. And I think that's something they've definitely lost sight of in the recent films in the past few years for absolute certain. But I think that was the important key factor to start the film with. You don't mess with Bond's character, but you can figure out ways to, over the course of the story, actually break down and analyze the character, what we like about Bond, what necessarily is not such a good thing about Bond, but that makes his character. That's part of his internal characterization. So you can't remove those elements. He is an assassin. He is a cold-blooded killer. He is an outsider. He is a very complex man who moves through a shadowy world of intelligence work and has years of experience, but also has to find ways to live with that experience. So I do really appreciate the sort of more serious spycraft and spy espionage thriller that creeps in. I'm not going to claim it's dark and gritty completely like a John le Carré novel or a Lynn Dayton novel or like Robert Ludlum's Bourne novels. But there is some of that feeling. It is creeping in there. And as a lover of spy thrillers and the original Fleming texts and the more serious, Terrence Young style of the initial Bond films, I do really pick up and appreciate that very much. And I think that does go back to the initial very dark story drafts from by Michael France, and then Jeffrey Kane being the second writer, and then again he went on to do the really great film adaptation of The Constant Gardener, which I think is a really great adaptation of le Carré. So you can see sort of that stuff in the mix. And Brosnan gives an incredible performance. It's very multifaceted, very layered, full of all kinds of great subtext. And again, I think his Bond is really the Bond of analysis. There is this self-aware quality. I know I talked about the film having this self-awareness, but I think Bond himself has this element of being slightly self-aware. Not necessarily of what came before in the legacy of the film series, because everybody has that. And of course, it's not an easy job to take on. It's got a lot attached to it. It's got a lot of baggage, and everyone has expectations on you. So of course, it adds this element of simply being nervous, as anybody would be terrified taking this role over. And again, I do really think that the first Bond performance of an actor does have and require that nervous energy, and I think Brosnan has it in spades. And for me, it's my favorite of his four performances. He definitely grows into the role as the previous actors before him did, but I like that edge he has here, and that sense of the world, that worldliness that Bond has, the way he moves through scenarios, like when he moves to the casino, when he's prowling the floors of MI6, but that that it's not a bitterness, but he is an experienced intelligence man. He knows the score, but as we get the great line in M's office, which is my favorite Bond line in the entire film, governments change, the lies stay the same, which that speaks, an entire career lifetime of experiences as a spy for MI6. And it's all intrinsic. You can blink and you miss it. You can just take Goldeneye as a straight-ahead action film or as another entry of the Bond series. But I think there's a lot of interesting subtext going on, and all of it goes back to trying to figure out how to work the traditional Bond scenario formula into a modern mid-90s atmosphere when the Cold War is long since over and the entire action film landscape is totally different. So you're also having to come into 1995 and compete with everything else, and the CG era has already started, so people are starting to go crazy with their effects, and it's the digital sound era, so the sound mixes have become more impressive. So it's a film that really it absolutely had to be successful for the series to continue. It's as important as The Spy Who Loved Me was in that regard, because The Spy Who Loved Me also was a make or break point. And after a switch up in the production, Harry Saltzman had sold his shares and left. Cubby Broccoli had to produce solo, and there was a gap between films. It was only 3 years from 1974 to 1977, and this was 6 years. So in some ways, Goldeneye was even more important because it was not only the second make or break point, but it was even longer of a gap. And there were even more naysayers, because it had been so long and Bond had already been seen as old hat and passé really for so long. So I find Goldeneye is really a very rewarding film if you're willing to go back and look at the historical context in which it was made, all the factors that went into its makeup and its DNA, and the different writers, different drafts, and Martin Campbell being a very committed and hands-on director and really trying to get a real charge to the events going on screen. And if you're willing to read into it and really let the film soak in, and particularly I think repeat viewings really help, it's a film that is definitely really impressive all these years later, and it's definitely the most balanced and the most well put together. It holds up the best of the 4 films of the Brosnan era, and I think that is the general consensus among all Bond fans and most people, general audiences who aren't diehard crazy Bond fans who decide to spend their spare time doing audio commentaries for every film. But that's not to say the other 3 films of the Brosnan era are bad or terrible. I enjoy and watch all of them every year, and they all have their own individual strengths that try to build off of what Goldeneye started. But of course, they all featured different directors, and the writing teams changed, and they all really had different aims at the times at which they were made, as pretty much every James Bond film does. They're not the same through and through, and they really need to always be considered for their individual aims and their production processes, and the goal of each film is always different, just as no Bond actor really ever plays the role the same way twice. Every film is a different reading of the character, and also basing that off of the story and the tonality of what the film is aiming for. So nothing in Bond is ever simple, and I think analysis of Bond films is truly important, and unfortunately not often done, because as I've always said in these commentaries, unfortunately the films are never really quite taken as seriously as they should be, because of course anything with a legacy such as Bond has absolutely has staying power and is worthy of analysis. So that's my commentary for 1995's Goldeneye and the initial film of the Pierce Brosnan era that successfully relaunched the James Bond film series for an entire new generation. If you've stayed with me through this whole track, I want to thank you ever so much for doing so. These tracks are very fun to do, but as I always say, they are not professionally recorded, and so please do bear with me as I try to keep my train of thought while I try to do running scene analysis and bits of production notes and my own general thoughts as I run along with the film and try to keep up and keep it amusing enough. Because, of course, every time I watch the films, my head sounds like one of these commentary tracks because I can't stop thinking about Bond. I think about Bond when I'm not watching the films. I think about Bond on a daily basis. So with that, James Bond will return, and I will return in my next commentary for 1997's Tomorrow Never Dies. And, of course, because nobody screws with Boris Grishenko, bang! I am invincible! Was it good for you too? I'm going to make some coffee. I'm going for a cigarette. I will return with my next commentary on Tomorrow Never Dies. As always, I'm very humbly yours, the motion picture analyst.